Before we begin, many thanks to our sponsor, Squarespace, the innovative, easy-to-use website builder that allows you to design and launch your own web pages. We'll tell you more later on in the video.
The man known to history as Winston Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace in the county of Oxfordshire, England on the 30th of November, 1874. His father, Randolph Churchill, had been the Conservative Member of Parliament for Woodstock, Oxfordshire, since 1874, when he succeeded his own father, John Spencer Churchill, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, after he entered the House of Lords. Winston's mother, Jenny Churchill, was American, her family's wealth coming from success in finance, although despite their wealth and connections, both Randolph and Jenny were often in debt and had money worries, which was a problem that would become all too familiar to Winston later in his life. In 1876, the family moved to Ireland after Winston's grandfather was made viceroy, and 3 years later, Jenny gave birth to Winston's brother Jack, which sparked rumours regarding his paternity, as Randolph and Jenny did not have a close relationship. Indeed, Winston's relationship with his parents was also distant, largely due to it being common in the English aristocracy at the time for children to be raised by nannies, and Winston was particularly devoted to his own nanny, Elizabeth Ann Everest, who he called Womany. When he was 7, Winston was sent to a boarding school at St. George's in Ascot, Berkshire, where he gained a reputation as an unruly pupil and did poorly academically, and after a spate of ill health, he was moved to the Brunswick School near Hove in East Sussex. At this time, Winston's father Randolph was considered to be one of Britain's foremost politicians, who had reached the peak of his career in 1886, when he was made Chancellor of the Exchequer. However, Randolph was renowned for being outspoken and often failed to gain the support of his fellow cabinet members in seeking cuts in public expenditure, particularly the military. He then, only after 4 months as Chancellor, handed in his resignation, calculating that he was too important a figure for the Conservative government to lose. But this gamble then backfired in spectacular fashion when the then Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, accepted his resignation, meaning that Randolph's career was effectively over. In contrast, Winston's performance at school had improved by this time, which then resulted in him narrowly passing his exams in 1888, after which he began studying at one of the best public schools in England, Harrow. His father was determined that Winston would pursue a career in the military, and after finishing his education, Churchill tried twice and failed to gain entry to the Royal Military College in Sandhurst, but on the third attempt he was accepted, and after a year of training, graduated as a cadet. However, Winston's pride at doing well at Sandhurst was short-lived, as in January of 1895, his father Randolph died of syphilis, which no doubt was a result of his extramarital liaisons, and for some time afterwards, Randolph's cause of death was kept from Winston. In February 1895, Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Hussars Cavalry Regiment of the British Army, and he then later that year travelled to the Caribbean, where he fought on the side of the Spanish Army against Cuban nationalists in their war for independence. After this, Churchill made the first of his many visits to the United States, where he spent time in New York, amongst other cities, and it is fair to assume that this journey, combined with Winston's American heritage, did much to form his lasting affection and admiration for his mother's homeland. After returning from North America, Churchill was posted to India in October of 1896, and a year later, in 1897, managed with the support of his mother to join the Malaccan Field Force as a correspondent, and saw combat against the Mohmand rebels, which he reported on in the British Daily Telegraph. After leaving India, Churchill wrote a book of his experiences, which gained positive reviews, and he then, using his greater notoriety, managed to gain a place on Herbert Kitchener's expedition to the Sudan to take on Abdullah ibn Muhammad, who had established an Islamic caliphate in the country. Ibn Muhammad had previously been one of the right-hand men of Muhammad Ahmad, the self-proclaimed Mahdi, or guided one, who according to Islamic prophecy was supposed to rid the world of evil and, along with Jesus, defeat the false Messiah or Antichrist. The Mahdi had started his Islamic uprising in the Sudan in 1881 and initially led a successful campaign in the region, even defeating a British-led Egyptian army at the Battle of Sheikhan in November 1883. This prompted the British Liberal government, who deemed the country not to be worth fighting for, to send Major General Charles Gordon to the Sudanese capital of Khartoum to evacuate Egyptian civilian personnel, but Gordon, on arrival, decided to fortify the city as the Mahdi's army had cut off river traffic on the River Nile to the north, making an evacuation impossible. Khartoum then fell to the Mahdi in January of 1885 after a 10-month siege, and Gordon, who was by this time a hero in Britain, was killed in the fighting and beheaded. However, the Mahdi himself also died soon afterwards of typhus and was replaced by Abdullah ibn Muhammad, who ruled over the Sudan until 1896, when the British, fearing a French invasion of the country, sent the previously mentioned invasion force to defeat the Islamists once and for all. Kitchener's army then journeyed down the Nile and defeated Ibn Muhammad's forces at the Battle of Omdurman, and Winston, a few days after the battle, was involved in a cavalry charge against the remnants of Muhammad's forces. Afterwards, Churchill wrote his account of the conflict, entitled The River War, in which he criticised Kitchener's handling of the campaign. Indeed, Churchill would become a prolific writer during his lifetime, eventually publishing over 24 books, with each often consisting of several volumes. After returning home, Winston sailed to South Africa to take part in the Boer War, and was, after being involved in several engagements, captured when the troop train he was travelling on was derailed during an ambush. Churchill was then sent to a prisoner of war camp near Pretoria, but managed to escape by climbing over the perimeter fence surrounding the camp, and, after being sheltered by sympathetic locals, succeeded in sneaking aboard a freight train heading to neutral Portuguese East Africa. His escapades during this period attracted a great deal of public attention, as well as praise in the British press, as the Boers had started a large-scale manhunt for him. Therefore, his successful escape was seen as a propaganda victory. Instead of sailing home and reaping the benefits of his newly found acclaim, Churchill sailed to Durban and was appointed as a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse before joining Redvers Buller's attempt to relieve the siege of the small town of Ladysmith in the Natal region of South Africa. The town had been under siege by a force of some 20,000 Boers for over 3 months, and supplies were getting scarce, with the troops being forced to survive on horses and oxen meat. Finally, after repeated attempts to break the Boer stranglehold, Buller's force broke through the enemy lines and Ladysmith was relieved, with Churchill being amongst the first troops to enter the town. Winston then arrived back in England 6 months later and sought to use the fame and notoriety he had earned on his travels to help him emulate his father Randolph by embarking on a career in politics. He then stood for office as the Conservative candidate in the constituency of Oldham, Greater Manchester, in 1900, winning by a slender margin, and afterwards embarked on a speaking tour of Britain and the United States, in which he gave lectures on his experiences in the Boer War. Churchill then, after returning home, threw himself into politics with the same vigour or rashness as he had exercised in his military career, by making controversial speeches over the next 2 years, in which he attacked the Conservative government of which he was a member. In these speeches, Winston continually criticised the Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, and his cabinet for their policies on free trade restrictions and excessive military expenditure, and over the coming years, continually voted against his own party, which inevitably resulted in him forming close political ties with the opposition Liberals. This disobedience eventually culminated in Churchill crossing the floor and joining the Liberal Party in 1904, which resulted in his deselection as a Member of Parliament for Oldham, but this gamble eventually paid off, as little over a year later, when the Liberals came to power in 1906, Winston was elected to be a Member of Parliament for Manchester North West instead. Churchill was then given the position of Under Secretary of State for the Commonwealth Office and worked to ease the continuing tensions in South Africa between British immigrants, the Boers, and the native population. Winston then embarked on a European and African holiday in 1906, in which he progressed across France and Germany, at one point meeting Kaiser Wilhelm, before travelling through Italy and on to Africa and Kenya, where he went game hunting. In 1908, Winston, who was now president of the Board of Trade, lost his seat in Manchester and was instead given a safer seat at Dundee in Scotland, after which he played an important role in the instigation of labour exchanges and unemployment insurance, which after a fierce struggle were approved in 1910, along with a myriad of other progressive liberal reforms, such as the Old Age Pensions Act of 1908. Indeed, it is fair to say that Churchill's political views were complex in the extreme, as he supported trade unions and welfare programs early in his political career, but later, on the other hand, argued for the preservation of Britain's empire. In short, Churchill was a complex character politically, as he evidently had some socialist, liberal, and conservative views, which can perhaps explain his changing allegiances during his career in Parliament. In 1908, Winston married Clementine Hosier, who would come to play a crucial role in his success in life, and it is entirely possible that without Clementine, Winston would not have been able to achieve the things he did in his career or recover from his regular bouts of depression, which he referred to as his black dog. In 1910, Churchill, despite still being relatively young, was appointed Home Secretary and attracted controversy on various incidents, such as the Cambrian Colliery dispute, his opposition to the suffragette movement, and the infamous siege of Sydney Street, in which two Latvian revolutionaries were cornered after committing a number of robberies and murders in Greater London, during which Churchill took control of the incident in person, which drew much criticism in the press. In 1911, Churchill was appointed to be First Lord of the Admiralty, placing him in charge of Britain's Royal Navy, which was then the most powerful on Earth. However, this maritime supremacy was beginning to become fragile at this time, as a host of nations around the globe were building scores of powerful warships. The decade before World War I had seen Britain and Germany in a naval arms race, and Winston was now tasked with overseeing the construction of a number of new battleships, including the Queen Elizabeth class, which were the fastest and most powerful ships ever launched by the Royal Navy at this time. After the outbreak of World War I and the stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front, the decision was made to attempt to knock Germany's ally Turkey out of the war by seizing control of the land surrounding the Dardanelles, which controlled the western approaches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Turkish capital of Constantinople and the Black Sea beyond. A combined British and French naval task force then set sail to capture the Dardanelles in early 1915, which ended in disaster after the Allied force failed to capture its objectives in the face of stubborn Turkish resistance. This, in turn, resulted in a 10-month battle of attrition, which only ended with the humiliating withdrawal of the Allied forces from the Dardanelles, in which they lost some 300,000 men, dead or wounded. Churchill, who, as First Lord of the Admiralty, had been one of the operation's prime advocates, was demoted in the aftermath of the campaign, as he was largely blamed for the expedition's defeat and the massive loss of life that resulted. This was a devastating blow for Winston, as the Gallipoli campaign, as it is now known, stained his reputation for decades and would almost certainly have ended the careers of less determined or driven men. In an effort to redeem himself, Churchill then volunteered to rejoin the army and was posted to the Western Front in early 1916 as a major with the Grenadier Guards and later a lieutenant colonel with the Royal Scots Fusiliers, with whom he saw combat on numerous occasions and was much respected by the troops under his command. Few, if any, could question Winston's bravery, but Lloyd George, who became Britain's Prime Minister in December of 1916, questioned if Churchill cared more about his own reputation and career than the fate of the country, and this nagging doubt about Churchill's motivations would remain in the minds of many of his detractors for years to come. Winston then returned to Parliament in the spring of 1916, and for the remainder of the war held important positions within the coalition government, including Minister for Munitions, Secretary of State for War, and Secretary of State for Air. An interesting fact about Churchill is that he was instrumental in the development of the tank, which would prove crucial in breaking the stalemate on the Western Front in the latter stages of the conflict, and it could be said that he played an important role in securing victory in both world wars. After the armistice of 1918, whilst at the War Office, Winston had a hand in the failed attempt to intervene in the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks, and after being appointed Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1921, was also involved in the instigation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which made Southern Ireland an independent nation and started the gradual disintegration of the British Empire. Then, in the 1922 election, Winston lost his seat in Dundee, largely due to him recovering from an appendix removal, after which he drifted away from the Liberals, but became a vocal critic of the new Labour government. Churchill had, by the early 20s, begun to once again associate himself with the Conservative Party, and after winning a seat in Parliament for the constituency of Epping, was appointed by the new Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924, which prompted him to then rejoin the Conservatives. However, Churchill's tenure as Chancellor was not that much more successful than his late father's, largely due to his disastrous policy of bringing Britain back into the gold standard. This was a form of account that fixed the price of money to that of the gold supply, and Churchill later admitted this was a mistake, as deflation of the pound ensued, and public spending was limited to the gold supply, meaning that in the coming Great Depression, the government had restricted cash flow with which to stop the banks from collapsing and stimulate the economy. It should be noted also that Churchill was a deeply unpopular figure in many ordinary people's eyes at this time, as they saw him as a warmonger, career politician, and political turncoat, whose decision to rejoin the gold standard had consigned an entire generation into abject poverty. The Conservatives were then soundly defeated in the general election of 1929, which resulted in Churchill being sidelined within the party, largely due to his unpopular opposition to Indian Home Rule, his actions regarding the gold standard, and his seemingly ever-changing allegiances. This in turn led to his decade-long wilderness years, in which Winston retreated from politics and focused on writing and his painting, which he in large part undertook to ease his sense of failure and depression. This culminated in him writing a 3-volume biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, who had defeated the armies of Louis XIV of France during various battles, such as Blenheim during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. Indeed, Churchill was a great expert on Marlborough, and there is a body of opinion that states his excellent grasp of history enabled him to see the parallels between Louis XIV and Adolf Hitler, both of whom sought to dominate Europe and persecute religious minorities. By this time, in the early 1930s, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany and was rearming the country at breakneck speed, which prompted Winston to make speeches and write articles warning of the possible threat that Nazi Germany posed. He was aided in this by Ralph Wigram, an official in the Foreign Office, who along with many other contacts had been passing intelligence on Germany's rearmament to Churchill, which gave his speeches and columns a lot more weight and in turn forced Stanley Baldwin's government, who had returned to power in 1935, to take notice. However, Churchill was still largely ignored in Britain, as many people throughout the country and world didn't want to contemplate the possibility of another European conflict, but these people were soon shaken out of their complacency, as by the late 1930s it all became too evident that Hitler was intent on aggressive expansion, and as the likelihood of war increased, Churchill was steadily accepted back into the mainstream of British politics. 2 days after World War II broke out in September 1939, Churchill was reappointed as First Lord of the Admiralty, but again, concerns over his judgment were raised after his plans to stop German iron ore shipments from Norway by raiding the port of Narvik in April of 1940 resulted in failure after Hitler invaded the country. Despite this operation being of Churchill's design, and it having worrying similarities with the Gallipoli disaster, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who had consistently tried and failed to prevent an outbreak of war, was forced to resign after the Labour Party made it clear it would not form a coalition government under his leadership. The choice of replacement was now between Churchill and Lord Halifax, who did not want the position. Therefore, Chamberlain then, on the evening of the 10th of May 1940, made the short journey from 10 Downing Street to Buckingham Palace to tender his resignation, after which he recommended that King George VI should invite Churchill to form a government. Winston Churchill was now the Prime Minister of Great Britain. However, he had ascended to the post in the midst of the most critical and dangerous crisis since the First World War, and the fate of the country was now firmly on his shoulders. He was then thrown right into the deep end from day one of his premiership, as the very same day he became Prime Minister, Germany invaded Holland, Belgium, and France, resulting in the military disaster that was the fall of Western Europe. Winston spent these desperate weeks travelling to and from the continent in the hope of keeping the French in the fight, but as its armies had all but collapsed in the face of the German advance, Churchill, along with his commanders, resolved to commit no more resources to the defence of Britain's ally, and instead decided to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from France before it was annihilated by Hitler's panzers and the Luftwaffe. This resulted, with the aid of civilian craft as well as the Royal Navy, in over 300,000 Allied troops being rescued from Dunkirk, meaning that Britain still had an army capable of putting up a fight in the event of a German invasion, and later resisting the Italian and German incursions into North Africa. Churchill now set about silencing the voices within his own government, particularly Lord Halifax, who were arguing for peace negotiations to begin with Hitler, and after doing so, began the mammoth task of reorganising the country's defences for the inevitable onslaught. After the surrender of France, the north of the country was occupied by Hitler's armies, and the vassalised south remained under the control of Philippe Pétain, with its capital being in the French city of Vichy. However, even though France itself had been dismembered, the country still had an empire, and along with it, a large war fleet based in the North African colony of Algeria. But with Vichy France effectively now being under German control, Churchill decided that Britain could not risk the French fleet falling into German hands, and ordered a naval task force to set sail into the Mediterranean in order to end the threat one way or another. Then, on the 3rd of July 1940, the British fleet arrived off the coast of Algeria and demanded the French hand over their battleships, but they refused, and the British then opened fire on their former allies, sinking one of the French battleships, damaging 2 others, and killing some 1,300 sailors. This was seen as treachery in France, and is still seen by many in the country today to be a war crime. However, from Britain and Churchill's perspective, the danger of the French fleet falling into German hands was too large to ignore, and although ruthless, its sinking was essential to ensure Britain's naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Hitler's planned invasion of Britain then commenced in July 1940, with mass air attacks on ground targets and radar installations across southern England, which were designed to cripple the country's air defences and facilitate a cross-channel invasion. However, Britain was well prepared for the German Luftwaffe, as it had pioneered the world's first air defence network, which is known today as the Dowding system, after the head of RAF Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding. This involved radar stations along England's south coast being linked via landlines to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory in northwest London, which along with the Royal Observer Corps enabled the British to build a live strategic overview of all inbound enemy air activity, and thusly send the required numbers of fighters to intercept them. This system was, far more than the British Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire, responsible for the eventual wearing down of German resistance in the Battle of Britain, as without it, the RAF would only have been able to defend the country's skies by means of random patrols. Over the coming months, the RAF and the Luftwaffe engaged in aerial combat above the skies of Britain, with massive losses on both sides, until by the end of the summer, the RAF was on its knees. However, on the 25th of August 1940, RAF bombers hampered by heavy cloud cover over Berlin dropped their payloads on residential areas, which in turn prompted Hitler to undertake reprisal bombing raids across London in what we know today as the Blitz. This change in strategy effectively saved Britain from any possible invasion, as the Luftwaffe now concentrated its efforts on bombing London instead of destroying the RAF, which quickly regrouped and strengthened its numbers of pilots and aircraft over the coming months. During the Battle of Britain and the Blitz on London, Churchill rallied the populace with some of the most famous speeches ever broadcast, which helped the British people realise the gravity of the threat which faced them, and also helped them strengthen their resolve to carry on the fight. Indeed, Winston's rallying of the British population was particularly crucial, as the country was now alone against Nazi Germany, and as its navy was scattered throughout the world, and Imperial Japan was now threatening military expansion of its own, things were desperate in the extreme. The war situation was then further complicated when the Italian fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, thinking Britain was too weak to oppose him, ordered the invasion of British-controlled Egypt in September 1940 via Italian Libya. This invasion was soon crushed, however, by British counterattacks, which forced the Italians back towards Tunisia, and in turn prompted Hitler, who feared a British victory would secure their dominance of the Mediterranean, to send General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to intervene. One of the few options that still lay open to Britain was to seek the assistance of the United States, and Churchill, being half American on his mother's side, had long enjoyed good relations within the country, and in particular with its president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The two men had much in common with one another, as they shared a love of the Navy and had been exchanging correspondence and gifts for some years, including Winston giving Roosevelt a signed copy of his biography of the Duke of Marlborough during the 1930s. This relationship was perhaps one of the most important factors in the eventual victory over the Axis powers, as Britain could simply not hope to defeat Germany, Japan, and Italy alone, and desperately needed assistance and supplies. Despite many within the United States, particularly those of Irish descent, understandably hating the British, Roosevelt, after careful and protracted lobbying, secured enough support to assist Britain, resulting in the system of aid which is known today as Lend-Lease. This was a program which involved the United States supplying Britain, Free France, China, and later the Soviet Union with food and war materials in return for gold, money, and access to naval bases throughout the globe. This was crucial in keeping Britain, which by now was a shrinking world power, in the conflict, and without it, it is almost certain the country would have had to secure peace terms with the Axis powers in 1941. It should not be forgotten also that Churchill was instrumental in securing the backing of the United States and Roosevelt. Indeed, him securing Lend-Lease was arguably one of his most important achievements, as without it, defeat would have been almost certain. The battle for North Africa was in full swing by this stage, a low point coming when the Germans captured Tobruk in 1942, and afterwards threatened to overrun Egypt, which would have almost certainly knocked Britain out of the war, as the Suez Canal was vital for the flow of supplies between Europe and Britain's empire, not to mention the massive oil reserves in the Middle East beyond it. Churchill also gave the go-ahead for the formation of the world's first Special Forces units at this time, namely the Commandos and the Special Air Service, or SAS, which consisted of volunteers who were given intensive extra training and better weaponry than regular troops. The Commandos were involved in various raids on the continent during World War II, including the brilliant raid on Saint-Nazaire, in which the only docks in France capable of holding the massive German battleship Tirpitz were destroyed. The SAS, on the other hand, were formed in North Africa and conducted brilliant raids behind enemy lines in the desert, destroying hundreds of German aircraft and various installations, severely damaging their fighting capability. Indeed, certain generals were against the use of special forces at the time, but Churchill overruled them, seeing their potential to cause havoc behind enemy lines as crucial to the war effort. Winston would later go on to champion the use of civilian resistance groups on mainland Europe, which were often directed and supplied by Britain's Special Operations Executive, or SOE, which conducted thousands of daring raids across occupied Europe during World War II. Perhaps the largest threat Germany posed to Britain after 1940 was its U-boat fleet, which through the early to middle stages of the war conducted daring raids on British and Allied shipping in the North Atlantic and severely hampered Britain's war effort, sinking millions of tons of supplies in the process. There is no doubt that Churchill himself considered the U-boat threat to be top priority, but over time, the British got the upper hand in the battle for the Atlantic, with the aid of the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, including the brilliant Alan Turing, who had cracked the German Enigma codes, which combined with the ever-increasing flow of war materials from America, steadily overwhelmed the limited numbers of German U-boats. In the meantime, Hitler had embarked on his massive invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, which quickly became the main focus of his attention, as it became clear to both him and the German High Command that subduing Stalin's Russia was not the easy task they had first thought. Churchill was, by this stage, regularly undertaking long and dangerous journeys to and from North Africa, the United States, and Britain, involving hundreds of thousands of air miles, and it is no exaggeration that the stress and workload he had undertaken was immense to say the least, and took a serious toll on his health. However, he was soon given what was perhaps the best news of the war from a British perspective, that being the attack by Imperial Japan on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, which led to Hitler declaring war on the United States himself 4 days later. Indeed, Hitler declaring war on America can be seen as the point where the war was effectively decided, as Germany could not hope to outproduce both the United States, Britain, and Russia in terms of food, supplies, or manpower. Therefore, the outcome of World War II was effectively decided as early as the winter of 1941. This was borne out over the coming years, as from 1942 onwards, the Axis powers' lack of resources, combined with their increasingly overstretched industry, resulted in a long process of retreat and defeat for them, culminating in the effective collapse of German resistance in Russia from 1943 onwards, their defeat in North Africa, and the subsequent invasion of Italy, along with the gradual liberation of all the Japanese territorial gains in the Pacific. Winston had effectively succeeded in his goals by this stage, as Britain was now the minor partner in the triple alliance between it, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and the remainder of the conflict would increasingly see both he and Britain taking a back seat in all theatres. However, without Churchill keeping Britain in the conflict, it is almost certain that the invasion of Italy and the later D-Day landings would never have taken place, in turn meaning that Stalin's Russia would have had to deal with Hitler's invasion alone, and very possibly collapsed as a result. In contrast to this, there has been a large amount of criticism of Winston Churchill in recent years, which has been centered on his involvement, or lack thereof, in trying to alleviate the Bengal famine of 1943, which came about after the Japanese occupied Burma and cut off rice imports to the eastern subcontinent in 1942. Churchill and his war cabinet, fearing a full-scale Japanese invasion of India, ordered a scorched earth policy in the region, in which thousands of acres of farmland were seized or even destroyed. This, combined with a series of natural disasters in 1942, including a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, effectively compounded the increasingly widespread starvation and famine, which culminated in the deaths of upwards of 3 million people in the region, although some say the figure is much higher. Churchill has largely been blamed for perpetuating and even instigating this famine by Indian and progressive historians in recent publications, as by this time his disregard for the country and its freedom-seeking populace was no secret. Indeed, some even compare Churchill with Hitler, claiming that he pursued genocidal policies in the subcontinent, even labelling him a racist mass murderer. On the other hand, Churchill's defenders claim that, when both he and his war cabinet became fully aware of the scale of the famine on the 24th of September 1943, they diverted 250,000 tons of grain to India. They also mention the fact that the Japanese invasion of Burma was one of the prime causes of the crisis, along with the lack of shipping due to the war, along with poor local government, misplaced food allocations, and natural disasters. Although Churchill's relationship with Roosevelt was cordial, if not friendly, his relationship with Stalin was fiery and interspersed with heated arguments. This meeting of ideological adversaries was first forged a year after the Nazi invasion of Russia had started, when Churchill made the dangerous journey via the Middle East to Moscow in August of 1942, where the two men held several alcohol-fueled meetings. The Man of Steel had long pressured the British to start a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on the Russians, but without American help, Britain simply did not have the manpower to undertake an amphibious landing on the continent. Churchill had, however, championed an invasion of Italy to start a second front, but the Americans were in favour of taking the most direct route through France. Given the hilly terrain of Italy, which naturally favoured defence, it has to be said that choosing France as the main focus of attack by the Western Allies was the correct one, as the invasion of Italy proved to be a slow and bloody conflict that did little more than tie down several German armies. One of the main ways the British had been able to carry the war to the Germans had been air raids, and by the later stages of the war, the RAF had accumulated a massive force of bombers, mainly consisting of the famous Lancaster. The British decided earlier in the war, due to large losses over Germany, to conduct night bombings, which was safer for bomber crews but resulted in less accuracy, whilst the Americans, after entering the war, mounted large-scale daylight raids. After the Blitz, it became British policy to target German cities and industrial centres in order to wear down Hitler's supply chain, and with ever-increasing air supremacy, it wasn't long before many German cities were reduced to rubble. Perhaps the greatest example of this was in the bombing of Dresden in February of 1945, in which over 20,000 people were killed, and after the war, both the head of the RAF Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, and Churchill were blamed for the deliberate bombings of civilian targets, as many people maintained it was a war crime. After victory in 1945, Churchill was voted out of office as Prime Minister, being replaced by the Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. However, Winston refused to be bitter about the defeat, despite him leading his country to victory, stating that the British people had had a hard time. In the following years, Churchill argued for the creation of the early European Union, or the United States of Europe as he called it, thinking it essential in preventing future conflict, and regularly gave speeches warning of the threat of the Soviet Union. He then continued as leader of the opposition during the post-war period until the general election of 1951, when he once again became Prime Minister. Churchill was the first Prime Minister of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, and proved to be a guiding influence for her in the early years of being monarch. However, his second tenure as Premier was largely dominated by struggling to deal with Britain's reducing role in the world and its withdrawal from empire, which was largely due to the country's near-exhausted and massively indebted economy. By this stage in his life, Winston had suffered numerous heart attacks and strokes, an early example of which occurred as early as 1941, when he had a heart attack whilst visiting President Roosevelt at the White House, and he also suffered another 2 years later after a bout of pneumonia. In many ways, it is remarkable that Winston lived to the age he did, as by modern standards, he was an alcoholic and was rarely to be seen without a drink or one of his famous Cuban cigars. His second spell as Prime Minister was then cut short when he suffered a severe and partially paralysing stroke on the evening of the 23rd of June 1953, which left him bedridden for the next 6 months, after which he returned to his duties. However, it was clear that Churchill was now unable to undertake the role of Prime Minister, and he finally resigned on the 5th of April 1955, handing the reins of government to his deputy, Anthony Eden. Now in retirement, Winston spent much of his time in his home at Chartwell in Kent with his wife Clementine, who had been with him through thick and thin since 1908, spending his time painting, writing, and relaxing abroad, loving the south of France in particular. His health continued to fail him, however, and on the morning of the 24th of January, 1965, after suffering another severe stroke, Sir Winston Churchill died. Britain and the entire Western world was left grieving at his death, and there was a widespread feeling that with Churchill's passing, an era had come to a close. He was then given the great honour of a state funeral, before which his lead-lined coffin was taken up the Thames by boat, passing the London docks, where cranes were lowered in his honour, before being taken to St. Paul's through the streets, lined with tens of thousands of grieving people. He was then taken by train to Woodstock, Oxfordshire, and laid to rest in the Churchill family cemetery at the Church of St. Martin's in the village of Blaydon, less than a few miles from his birthplace at Blenheim Palace. Sir Winston Churchill is today widely regarded as one of Britain's greatest prime ministers. Despite his faults and mistakes, both personal and professional, there is no doubt that without his resolve, bravery, and fortitude, victory over the Axis powers, and Hitler's Germany in particular, would have been next to impossible. His key contributions to the Allied war effort was keeping Britain in the war, which ultimately enabled D-Day to happen, and there is also a body of opinion which states that without Britain's Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union from 1941 onwards, Stalin's Russia may have also collapsed under the German onslaught. Some claim that Churchill was a warmonger and placed his own personal ambitions above the needs of his country, whilst others state that in India he is responsible for war crimes, particularly in the Bengal famine. To the majority of people, however, particularly in the West, Sir Winston Churchill remains a hero, as without his insistence in continuing the fight against Hitler's Germany, Western Europe, Russia, and possibly the entire world would have fallen to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. What do you think of Winston Churchill? Was he a war hero or a war criminal? Let us know in the comments section, and until next time, thank you very much for watching.
Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor, Squarespace, the market leader in web page design. Squarespace gives you the tools you need to produce a stylish, professional website for your content. Its easy-to-navigate interface and helpful templates allow you to customize your online presence as you wish. You can merchandise your products using the commerce section, and management tools and checkout options put you in control of your own personal business website. Choose your domain name, design your website, and at checkout, head to squarespace.com/thepeopleprofiles and add promo code ThePeopleProfiles for 10% off your first purchase of your own website domain.
Roosevelt family estate at Springwood in Hyde Park, at which Eleanor had to endure the difficulty of living next door to her mother-in-law, and the couple then went on to parent 6 children together, one of whom, Franklin Jr., died in infancy in 1909. Despite giving birth to 6 children, Eleanor found married life to be difficult in many respects, and at one point stated that she found intercourse to be an ordeal that had to be endured, and this lack of natural intimacy would later result in Franklin having numerous affairs, and Eleanor herself would also go on to form close and possibly intimate friendships with a number of women. Perhaps the most notorious of Franklin's affairs was with his wife's secretary, Lucy Mercer, which began in or around 1916, that Eleanor then discovered when she found letters between the two by accident, which nearly ended their marriage, and it was only after Franklin's mother stepped in and told him that if he divorced Eleanor, she would disinherit him, that their union was spared. Despite this tumult, both Franklin and Eleanor would remain married until his death in 1945. But perhaps as a consequence of his extramarital liaisons, it remained a union based on mutual respect or duty rather than love or passion. However, regardless, Eleanor made Franklin promise that he would never see Lucy again, which was an oath that he would struggle to keep. In 1910, Franklin joined the local Democratic Party, which was eager to recruit him due to his family's name, and after being accepted and nominated, Roosevelt campaigned for a seat on New York's State Assembly, and after leading an energetic campaign, in which he travelled around the local area by car, Franklin won to the surprise of many, despite the local area being predominantly Republican, and he then assumed his new responsibilities on the 1st of January, 1911. Roosevelt then quickly gained a reputation as something of a radical within the local Democratic Party, leading a group of so-called insurgents, who were opposed to Tammany Hall, which was a political organisation in the area that controlled nominations and dictated policy, and had a reputation for corruption or looking after the interests of the rich and not the working classes or poor. Because of this, Franklin soon became a popular figure with many New York Democrats, and he then, in the 1911 Democratic nominations, caused controversy within his family, when he backed Woodrow Wilson and not his cousin Theodore Roosevelt's campaign for the presidency of the United States. Theodore had left the Republicans after failing to secure the party's nomination to campaign during the forthcoming election, which caused divisions within the party, and he then ran as an independent candidate for a newly created and short-lived Progressive Party. Despite him failing to secure his cousin's backing, Theodore was not angered by Franklin's support of Woodrow Wilson, as he was after all a member of the Democratic Party, which he would have been forced to resign from in order to support him, and it could be said that this was, in hindsight, the correct decision, as Theodore's progressives fell into obscurity over the coming years. Franklin's decision to back Woodrow Wilson was then vindicated when he won the presidential election of 1912, becoming the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland, who left office in 1889. This election victory was a landslide for the Democrats, who won nearly 42% of the popular vote, and Roosevelt was then rewarded for his support of Wilson by the new president appointing him to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, under Josephus Daniels. Shortly after this appointment, Franklin resigned from his seat on New York's State Assembly in order to concentrate on his career in Washington, D.C., as he was seen by many to have a promising future ahead of him due to his intelligence, work ethic, and family name. During their time in the department, both Roosevelt and Daniels oversaw the introduction of a new merit-based system of promotion within the United States Navy, as well as extending civilian control over various aspects of naval administration, in which Franklin oversaw relations between the government and the members of the Navy's civilian workforce. This position would give Franklin a great amount of experience in dealing with labour issues, as well as industrial disputes, and also in naval administration during wartime that would both prove to be invaluable to him during the later Great Depression, as well as the Second World War, and it was this period as Assistant Secretary that forged his affiliation and love for the American Navy that would endure for the rest of his days. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, and there was a strong consensus of opinion that the United States should begin to rearm in case it was forced to join the conflict, and as a result, President Wilson then gave the go-ahead for an expansion of the Navy that was accelerated after the sinking of various civilian vessels, including the RMS Lusitania in 1915. Because of this, the United States Navy was more than doubled in size by the end of World War I, that ended after America joined the Allies against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria, which greatly hastened their ultimate surrender in the Armistice of 1918, and after the conflict, the US Navy was scaled back to peacetime numbers. In the aftermath of the First World War, President Wilson attempted to ensure lasting peace throughout the globe by establishing the League of Nations, which was first proposed and included as part of the Treaty of Versailles that was signed on the 28th of June 1919, creating the first international convent designed primarily to maintain world peace. However, the creation of the League of Nations greatly weakened Wilson's position as president in the eyes of many Americans, particularly those of a Republican persuasion, who feared their country's sovereignty could potentially be superseded by an international governing body, and who were also opposed to any American involvement in the affairs of foreign nations. This opposition then continued to gain momentum, until finally the Republican-dominated Senate rejected the president's plans for America to join the League of Nations, and Wilson's position was then further undermined by him suffering a massive stroke on the 2nd of October 1919 that left him bedridden for weeks, and his administration, much like himself, paralysed. It is no exaggeration to say that Woodrow Wilson's policies, at least in regard to foreign affairs, provided a template for Franklin Roosevelt's own political ideas over the coming decades, as he would, after the Second World War, resurrect his mentor's plans for a League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations. As it was now becoming increasingly evident that President Wilson's tenure was coming to an end, Roosevelt and his allies reached out to Herbert Hoover about the possibility of him becoming the party's next candidate for the presidency in the 1920 presidential elections. Hoover had formerly been a member of President Wilson's administration, but had never been a member of either party in the lead up to the election of 1920, but then calculating that the Democrats were unlikely to be victorious, declared himself as a Republican, but failed to secure the party's nomination for the presidency by losing to Warren G. Harding. This in turn scuppered Franklin's plans to run as vice president under Hoover, but after James M. Cox was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate instead, he chose Roosevelt as his running mate, and despite both men embarking on a campaign across the country, they were defeated by a wide margin in the election by Warren G. Harding, who became the 29th President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1921. The return of the Republicans to power simultaneously heralded a return of America to isolationism, in which involvement in foreign affairs was kept to a minimum, until finally the sleeping giant that was the United States of America was awoken from its slumber by the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the mid-1930s. Although this loss was a bitter pill to swallow, Roosevelt had gained valuable experience in campaigning on the national stage, and was now a major figure within the Democratic Party, and was also seen by many to be the great hope of the left wing within America going forward. However, Franklin's hopes and dreams would soon be dashed to near smithereens when he, in August 1921, began to experience terrifying symptoms of paralysis from the waist down, combined with bladder and bowel dysfunction. The diagnosis for these ailments was grim to say the least, as Franklin had contracted poliomyelitis, otherwise known as polio, which is an infectious disease caused by the polio virus that is often transferred from person to person by infected fecal matter entering the mouth, possibly via unwashed food or unclean water. There has since been speculation that Roosevelt's symptoms were more consistent with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is caused by the immune system attacking the peripheral nervous system, which in short is the relay between the brain and the limbs. But whatever the cause of his illness, Franklin was now paralysed from the waist down and would never walk or even stand unaided again. This illness would have ended the lives of many men, let alone their careers. However, Roosevelt evidently possessed great reserves of strength and determination, as he then set about trying to lead as normal a life as possible to ultimately facilitate his return to mainstream politics. He did this by having the pedals of his car adapted so he could brake and accelerate by hand, and even had a pair of iron braces constructed to enable him to stand or walk with assistance, where he would use his waist to swivel each limb in turn, enabling him to move upright for short distances. Despite these innovations, Franklin would spend the majority of his waking hours sitting in one of his custom-built wheelchairs, meaning that he would often have to be carried up and down flights of stairs in buildings where no elevators were installed, and this soon prompted him to have a service lift adapted at his home in Hyde Park, which enabled him to travel between floors unaided. Over the coming years, Franklin would go to great lengths to ensure he was never publicly photographed in his wheelchair, and would, when he was giving speeches or appearing in public, often be seen to stand by using his steel leg braces, along with the literal support of an aide, or one of his children. For the time being at least, Roosevelt's illness meant that he had to withdraw from frontline politics for a time during the 1920s, so he could come to terms with his disability both mentally and physically. But despite this retreat, he still maintained close connections with the top of the Democratic Party, for which he would eventually give presidential nomination speeches in 1924 and 1928. Although these speeches were outwardly a show of support for the Democratic nominees, they were in reality dress rehearsals for Franklin's own political resurrection, as he calculated that he could not hope to win any future Democratic nomination, let alone the presidency, without being seen to be able to stand, and during both addresses, he wowed the crowds whilst gripping the podium with all his strength in a desperate effort to remain upright. This effort to appear mobile was in large part due to Franklin's fear that his disability would be used against him by his Republican rivals, whom he thought would claim his inability to walk would also impair his ability to govern, and it is certainly remarkable that throughout his lifetime and his later presidency, the true nature of Roosevelt's disability would remain unknown to the vast majority of the American public, who thought him requiring assistance to walk was due to him being lame or arthritic. Despite Franklin's public support, the Democrats were defeated in the presidential elections by the Republicans in both 1924 and 1928, largely due to the fact that the economy was booming, and also because the party was divided on various issues such as prohibition, that banned the production and consumption of alcohol from 1920 to 1933. Indeed, Roosevelt himself, like many men of his class, enjoyed drinking expensive cocktails, which along with chain smoking would become his guilty pleasures. In the lead up to the 1928 election, Al Smith, who was the Democratic nominee for the presidency, was forced to step down as governor of New York, as he could not by law hold the position as well as the presidency, meaning that an election had to be held to appoint a new governor as a consequence. Smith, fearing a Republican landslide, then asked Roosevelt to run as the Democratic candidate for the governorship of New York, and after a hard-fought campaign, Franklin was eventually triumphant, winning by the slender margin of 1% of the vote, making him the head of government in America's most populous state and a frontrunner for the next Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. In contrast to this, the Democrats and Al Smith were crushed in the presidential election, losing heavily to Herbert Hoover, which effectively ended Smith's ambitions of claiming the top job, and he would later go on to become the president of Empire State Incorporated, which was the company responsible for the construction of the marvel of architecture and engineering that is the Empire State Building in Manhattan. Then, on Tuesday the 29th of October 1929, the Wall Street crash sent the world's economy into turmoil, causing share prices of the New York Stock Exchange to collapse. This crash was primarily caused by a huge amount of speculative public investment being made in the US stock market during the late 1920s, in which millions of Americans invested their life savings into the stock market in the hope of making a fortune by buying shares in what they hoped were up-and-coming companies and/or commodities. To cash in on this boom of investment, many people even took out loans in order to buy more stocks and shares, and when no further loans could be obtained, they then bought stocks on an IOU basis, in the hope that they would be able to pay at a later date, as and when they made a profit. Another factor was corruption and insider dealing, which was undertaken by men such as Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President John F. Kennedy, who during the 1920s sought to buy worthless stocks en masse, which made them appear to be a good speculative investment to the untrained eye. This mass buying then inflated the price of these stocks and shares, which Kennedy and his like would then cash in on by selling them to inexperienced investors, such as the general public, who would in the end lose nearly all their money when the stock market crashed. Kennedy would later go on to make millions during the Great Depression itself, by buying up potentially valuable real estate and land at reduced prices, that he would then later sell when the market improved over the coming decades, which at least in part funded his family's rise to power in US politics. No one knows what actually triggered the massive selling of stocks that initiated the Wall Street crash, but historians and economists have since speculated that a combination of rumour, hearsay, and the spread of panic caused a chain reaction of mass selling that flooded the market and as a result caused stock prices to tumble and millions of dollars to be lost. It should also be noted that the Wall Street crash was not the direct cause of the following Great Depression, but it certainly did undermine the confidence of the American public in the country's financial institutions, particularly the banks, as well as the government and Federal Reserve. Indeed, although many of America's smaller local banks were still solvent and soundly run, the larger banks had, during the market boom of the 1920s, invested their customers, investors, and depositors' money into the US stock market, meaning that when the crash came, the banks lost millions of dollars of their customers' money that they were unable to give back due to the lack of funds. This meant that the banks were soon forced to deny cash withdrawals to the American public, which caused a panic-driven chain reaction or bank run across America and then the wider world, as millions of people rushed to withdraw their non-existent savings. This lack of cash flow inevitably crippled consumer spending, as well as lending, meaning that there were mass shortages of capital within the American economy, and as a result, businesses laid off workers in their millions, or closed altogether, and as America was the largest economy on Earth, the contagion spread across the globe, as international loans were recalled in the desperate search for money and private investment was slashed. The recall of these international loans inevitably devastated the economies of countries around the world who were still struggling to recover from the devastation of the First World War, particularly nations such as Germany, Italy, and Japan, who then saw a rise in radical nationalistic political parties who would seize power over the coming decade and plunge mankind into another world war. This panic and lack of capital was then further compounded by President Herbert Hoover's administration itself, as it thought the crisis would be short-lived and therefore refused point-blank to stimulate the economy with quantitative easing, which involved the printing of money that would enable the banks to stay open and lending and investment to continue. The government then arguably made things worse by raising tariffs on international trade, which did nothing but damage businesses across America and around the world, as it only restricted international transactions as well as the flow of goods. The Wall Street crash and following Great Depression inevitably damaged Herbert Hoover's reputation, particularly concerning economic matters, and with the end of his term fast approaching, Franklin Roosevelt stepped up his plans to run for the Democratic nomination for the presidential election in 1932. To help secure his future candidacy, Roosevelt first sought re-election as governor of New York by enacting and advocating various reforms to alleviate the crisis, such as setting up an employment commission, endorsing unemployment insurance, and aid to farmers, as well as better pensions for the elderly. These policies clearly resonated with New York's population, as he then won the state election by a 14% margin over his Republican rival, which solidified his position as the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. During the following months, Roosevelt appointed his campaign team and ramped up his plans for the forthcoming Democratic National Convention of 1932, at which he clinched the party's nomination by defeating Al Smith, who came a distant second. Roosevelt then, along with his running mate for the vice presidency, John Nace Garner, launched his presidential campaign, in which he pledged his support for America's workers by promising better regulation of the economy, stock market, and banking system, along with the cutting of trade tariffs, financial help for farmers, and investment in public works, in order to end the Great Depression. Franklin then went on to defeat Herbert Hoover by a massive landslide in the 1932 presidential election, by winning 57% of the popular vote and crucially securing control of both houses of Congress, meaning that he was able to pass legislation with greater ease without Republican interference. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was then inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1933, in which he gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, stating, "So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." This rallying cry was important, as the American economy had slumped to new lows in the final months of the Hoover administration, making the task that now faced Roosevelt enough to vex a genius, as 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed and a further 2 million people were on the streets and in a state of near starvation. On top of this, food prices had fallen by nearly 60%, meaning that many farmers were now facing ruin, and tens of thousands of banks were refusing cash withdrawals, which meant the businesses could not pay their employees and families could not buy food or goods. During his tenure as state governor of New York, Roosevelt gave regular radio broadcasts direct into people's homes that he named his fireside chats, in which he would lay out his plans for governance or address issues, and after becoming president, Franklin then continued these broadcasts on a national scale, informing the population of what he planned to do to address the economic turmoil. Almost immediately upon assuming his role as president, Roosevelt sought to address the paralysis that was gripping the banking system when he, on the 9th of March 1933, passed the Emergency Banking Act that gave him power to control bank opening times and also enabled him to order the Federal Reserve to issue currency so that cash withdrawals could recommence. This action then had the desired effect, as 6 days later, on the 15th of March, the banks reopened, causing share prices to rise by 15% as a consequence, as public deposits and withdrawals resumed, which effectively ended the bank run. After this, Roosevelt then initiated his program of relief, recovery, and reform as part of his strategy for ending the Great Depression, which is known today as the New Deal. He started by setting up the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in May of 1933, that was established to provide assistance to state governments by means of loans as well as grants, so that they could relieve unemployment through public work programs. The president then later that year signed a repeal that brought an end to prohibition, largely in an effort to help stimulate the economy and increase tax revenue, along with the people's morale, and shortly after signing the repeal, Franklin stated that he thought this would be a good time for a beer. These reforms were also augmented by the setting up of the Public Works Administration that would come to spend nearly $7 billion over the next decade, which is a massive figure in today's money, by initiating infrastructure projects throughout the country from roads to railways to dams and schools. This glut of state investment was then further increased by the establishment of further agencies, including the Civilian Conservation Corporation, that got 250,000 young men back into work on more local, rural projects, as well as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which helped industry with funding for railroads along with large infrastructure projects. On top of this, the Federal Trade Commission helped farmers and homeowners with mortgage relief, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to raise commodity prices by paying farmers to reduce their food production by leaving fields bare and cutting back on livestock. To ensure workers were better paid and fairly treated going forward, the president then brought in the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 that was enacted to regulate industry and ensure fair wages for workers, and also restricted production to keep prices at an even level. As well as all this, Roosevelt sought to cut federal spending by slashing military expenditure by over $700 million, by restricting servicemen's pensions, but after a campaign was instigated by veterans lobby groups, Congress overruled him and paid out the pension benefits in cash regardless, which in the end gave the economy a further boost through consumer spending. Then, from 1935 to 1936, the Roosevelt administration enacted the second part of its plans for relief and reform that is known today as the Second New Deal, which by and large consisted of further public investment but more importantly focused on economic reform across various sectors. These included the 1935 Social Security Act that ensured the federal government was from then on bound by law to give aid to the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled, as well as children in need, which was augmented with a kind of base state healthcare provision to ensure the poor had a certain degree of medical care. There then came the Works Progress Administration, which was the largest public works program to date that funded the building of parks, schools, bridges, and roads in nearly every community across the country, and between 1935 and 1943, the WPA employed nearly 9 million people, whose wages would then buy food and consumer goods, that in turn pumped money back into the economy, producing the knock-on effect of generating new jobs. Next came the National Labour Relations Act that prevented the exploitation of workers by giving them fair working conditions, as well as pay, and also ensured that the industrial disputes and strikes did not occur through civil discourse between employers and employee unions. Although Roosevelt's New Deal did produce its desired effect in getting millions of Americans back into work, it was met with fierce resistance within certain quarters of the private sector, as well as the Republican establishment, who were opposed to any kind of state intervention in the economy, and there is still a fierce debate today as to whether the centralized power of the Roosevelt administration was in keeping with America's capitalist principles, and some even claim that his program of reforms and relief was socialist in its outlook. One of the most ardent critics of Roosevelt's policies during this period was his old political ally, Al Smith, who as a conservative Democrat was opposed to the president's interference in private industry, and during the lead up to the 1936 presidential election, Smith tried to portray Roosevelt as a communist in all but name, and even compared him to Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. But Smith's public criticism soon backfired in spectacular fashion, as Roosevelt's reforms had lifted millions of people out of poverty and meant that he now had the loyal support of the majority of the American public, as well as the country's unions, who saw Al Smith and the business leaders opposed to the New Deal as the kind of people who had caused the economic upheaval in the first place. Seeking to capitalize on his overwhelming approval ratings, Roosevelt then sought re-election as president in 1936 and won an unprecedented victory by securing all but 2 states, which was the largest margin of victory since the uncontested presidential election of 1820. Roosevelt's second term was largely dominated by him struggling to overcome the resistance of the US Supreme Court that had blocked or halted several of his New Deal reforms, and he then sought to end its opposition by proposing a bill to replace aging Supreme Court justices with his own supporters, which was subsequently blocked by a cross-party coalition who feared that Roosevelt's bill would make both he and his successors too powerful. Indeed, one of the criticisms that could be leveled at Franklin Roosevelt is that he was too controlling of his administration, as he was notoriously devious and conniving in his dealings, and famously once said that he never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing. This control and secrecy even extended to his last vice president, Harry Truman, who was kept in the dark about many of Roosevelt's plans during World War II, including the United States nuclear weapons program. However, one of the few people Franklin was unable to control in his life was his wife Eleanor, who consistently lobbied him throughout his presidency on matters that were close to her heart, such as help for the poor, as well as civil and women's rights, that she promoted during public appearances and radio broadcasts, and even held nearly 350 press conferences during her husband's tenure. Eleanor would also spend much of her time traveling the country, after which she would report back to her husband on the progress of his New Deal, and it is fair to say that her activism certainly aided her husband, who after all could not travel easily, as she would, after returning from her visits, brief the president at length on the situation across the country and what action she felt were required. This inevitably caused a great deal of friction between Franklin and Eleanor during his presidency, although on the whole they came to form a formidable political partnership that earned them both the respect and admiration of millions of Americans. By the late 1930s, there were growing concerns at the rise of Adolf Hitler's Germany in Europe, which was seeking to expand its borders by annexing neighbouring countries such as Austria and Czechoslovakia, that along with the aggressive expansion of the Japanese Empire in Manchuria, modern-day China, was starting to threaten world peace. The United States' foreign policy had since the end of the First World War been isolationist in its outlook, because many people within the country did not want to interfere in any costly European wars, which was further complicated by large portions of the US population being descendants of European immigrants from countries like Germany and Italy. Roosevelt, who was a believer in Woodrow Wilson's outward-looking policies, was not an isolationist himself, but as his hands were largely tied by Congress and public opinion, he was prevented from interfering in the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the late 1930s. This outlook then began to change, however, when Hitler broke his Munich Agreement with Britain and France that had allowed Germany to occupy the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia in 1938 by invading the rest of the country the following year on the 15th of March 1939. This prompted Roosevelt to begin preparations for a possible war with the Axis powers over the coming months, as he recognised that America could no longer afford to maintain its isolationist stance, particularly as Japan was evidently bent on expansion of its own in the South Pacific, which could in time potentially threaten the United States colonies in the region, such as the Philippines. Then when Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, which prompted Roosevelt to align himself with the Western Allies, and then when France itself fell to Germany in the summer of 1940, isolationism in the United States went into a steep decline, which garnered enough support to allow the president to sanction a massive increase in military spending, along with the country's first peacetime draft that would swell the ranks of the US Army to nearly 1.5 million men by 1941. Roosevelt also proved to be pragmatic in his choice of military advisors at this time, as he appointed Republican interventionists such as Henry Stimson and Frank Knox as his Secretaries of War and the Navy respectively, both of whom were in favour of his support of Britain after the fall of France, and as both men were not Democrats, their promotions helped win over many Republicans to the president's side. The president then increased his support of Britain and its new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, with whom he had been in regular correspondence with since the 1930s, by giving the Royal Navy 50 World War I destroyers in return for access to naval bases across the Caribbean, which proved to be invaluable in strengthening ties between the two nations, as well as the United Kingdom's naval defences. Roosevelt had before this sought to help the European allies by passing the Neutrality Act in November of 1939, that allowed the sale of US weapons in return for cash. However, this aid to Britain, Free France, China, and later the Soviet Union would be escalated into the $50 billion program of aid that is known today as Lend-Lease, which was passed into law in March of 1941, that allowed war materials and resources to be lent or leased to allied nations, under the pretext that doing so would aid US national security. Although it was traditional for US presidents to only serve 2 tenures in office, as the 2-term period was not yet enshrined within the US Constitution, because the United States was clearly entering into another period of crisis, Roosevelt then decided to campaign for re-election, that resulted in him winning an unprecedented 3rd term on November 5th, 1940, in which he won nearly 55% of the popular vote and 38 of the then 48 states. This election was timely to say the least, as less than a month later, Imperial Japan would force America into World War II by launching one of the most notorious and daring preemptive strikes in the history of warfare, in an effort to secure domination of the Pacific Ocean. Although the head of the Japanese state was its Emperor Hirohito, the country's government had since the devastation of the Great Depression, much like Germany, come under the control of militaristic nationalists, who advocated the rejection of democracy, along with Western liberal culture, and sought to end Japan's dependence on foreign imports of raw materials, by means of the creation of an Asian Pacific empire. The first stage of this expansion took place in 1931, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria, which was then followed 6 years later by its annexation of China in 1937. That prompted the United States and Roosevelt to halt all exports of material from America that could aid the Japanese war effort, which included nearly 95% of Japan's oil supply. This essentially forced the Japanese to choose between halting their expansion or escalating it, the former of which was not an option. Therefore, plans were put into place for further invasions and attacks on territories and islands across South Asia, as well as the Western Pacific, including British imperial outposts, along with US colonies in the Philippines. The Japanese now saw the nullification and subjugation of both Britain's Eastern Empire and America's Pacific colonies and naval bases as key to securing their supremacy over the region, and it was also decided that the United States Pacific Fleet based in Hawaii would have to be destroyed in order to ensure Navy supremacy in the Far East, and plans were then drawn up in the late 1930s to bring this about. The likelihood of war was then increased by the appointment of Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister of Japan on the 17th of October 1941, who had long advocated a preemptive strike against the United States, and over the following months preparations were finalized with the Emperor's approval by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, for a massive naval task force to attack the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, along with simultaneous invasions of British and American colonies and overseas stations in the Western Pacific. In the meantime, negotiations were attempted with the aim of preventing hostilities, but when the Americans demanded a full Japanese withdrawal from China in return for the re-establishment of trade, the decision was taken by the Japanese to initiate war with the United States. On the 26th of November 1941, a massive task force set sail from the Japanese home islands under the command of Admiral Choichi Nagumo and headed east across the northern Pacific, before turning south towards the Hawaiian archipelago. This fleet consisted of 6 aircraft carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shukaku, and Zukaku, which carried over 400 aircraft and were escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 23 submarines. The Japanese then continued to approach Hawaii, and finally attacked the islands on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, resulting in over a dozen US ships being sunk or badly damaged, including 8 battleships and over 2,000 servicemen and civilians being killed or injured. However, the prime targets of the Japanese, the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out of port at the time of the attack, which was of vital importance, as these carriers would later form the nucleus of the United States Pacific Fleet that would come to decimate the Japanese Navy over the coming months and years. One day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declared war on Imperial Japan, and the same day delivered a speech to a joint session of the US Congress stating that, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. 3 days later, on the 11th of December 1941, Germany and Italy joined with their Japanese allies and declared war on the United States. That in effect sealed their doom, as the world's richest and most powerful industrial nation had now joined the conflict with whom the Axis powers could not hope to compete. This overwhelming might did not take long to manifest itself, as little more than 6 months after Pearl Harbor, in June of 1942, the United States Navy, along with the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, engaged and defeated the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway in the South Pacific, in which all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, meaning that the country's offensive capability in the Pacific theater was effectively ended in one fell swoop. The Japanese were from this point onwards forced onto the defensive across the Pacific, and the Americans then started their operations against the European Axis powers, when they landed in North Africa in late 1942, culminating in over 300,000 Axis troops surrendering in Tunisia 6 months later, which came only a few months after Hitler had lost a further 500,000 troops in the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. The main reason for these Allied victories were not simply their advantages in sheer manpower, but also lay in the colossal industrial capability the United States possessed, as between 1941 and the end of the war in 1945, the Americans produced nearly 2.5 million trucks, 90,000 tanks, and in 1944 alone produced more aircraft than Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. This industrial might, combined with plentiful natural resources, were the key to the American and Allied victory during World War II, as both Germany and Japan's natural resources were pitiful in comparison, and their industrial capacity was a mere fraction of the United States alone. Although Roosevelt decided that the war against Hitler's Germany was to be given priority over Japan, the Americans were still able, after the Battle of Midway, to steadily retake all of the Japanese conquests in the South Pacific in a succession of hard-fought amphibious assaults over the coming years, until by 1945, Japan was cut off, surrounded, and starving. In the lead-up to the opening of the Second Front in Europe, President Roosevelt had advocated that any Allied invasion should take place via northern France, whereas Winston Churchill in contrast argued that any invasion should be conducted through the Italian peninsula, stating that the country was Hitler's soft underbelly. However, the Italian theatre in reality turned out to be Hitler's tough old gut, as the country's hilly terrain naturally favoured the defensive. Therefore, the Americans' assertion that the major Allied invasion should be conducted through France can in hindsight be said to have been the correct course of action, as it resulted in a relatively speedy advance through Normandy after the D-Day landings, ensuring that Western Europe was not overrun by the Soviets after Germany's collapse. Despite Roosevelt's disability, it soon became evident during late 1942 that a conference was needed between the leaders of the Allied powers in order to better coordinate the war, and as the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin refused to travel far from Moscow, the decision was taken for both Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt to meet in the Iranian capital of Tehran in late November of 1943. This involved Roosevelt having to travel over 7,000 miles from America to the Middle East, which took a massive toll on his health, and at the conference he sought to appease the Soviet Premier by distancing himself from Winston Churchill over the future of Eastern Europe, as he did not want Stalin to think that the Americans and the British were acting as a unified force. This involved Roosevelt refusing to partake in discussions regarding the post-war status of Poland, as he felt there were more pressing concerns, and seeing as the Soviets were bound to occupy the country over the coming months, Roosevelt calculated that it was more important to appease the Soviet Premier rather than alienate him. This cordial approach towards the Soviet Premier is illustrated by Roosevelt's response to Stalin's demand that 50,000 German officers should be shot after the war, to which the president jokingly replied that maybe 49,000 would be enough. That was met with outrage and disbelief from the British Prime Minister. In the end, Churchill's approach towards Stalin would prove to be correct, as Eastern Europe was subjected to nearly half a century of Soviet occupation after World War II. Therefore, it would perhaps be argued that Roosevelt's cordial attitude towards the Soviet Union was misguided. However, the Tehran Conference and the 14,000-mile round trip that it entailed had a devastating effect on Roosevelt's health, as he had been under massive stress for over a decade by this time, which was in no doubt down to the fact that during his presidency, America had been in an almost constant state of crisis. A chain smoker, Roosevelt had enjoyed a daily diet of fine food and cocktails for many years, but as he was unable to undertake regular exercise, it soon became apparent that his lifestyle and workload was taking its toll, which would later be further exasperated by him embarking on an even longer journey to meet with Stalin and Churchill in the Crimean city of Yalta in February of 1945. As a result of his visible deterioration, Roosevelt then underwent tests at Bethesda Hospital, Maryland in March of 1944, and was found to the great alarm of his attending doctor to have incredibly high blood pressure that at one point hit 240 over 130, and was also found to be suffering from coronary artery disease and heart failure, effectively meaning his time was short. To avert imminent disaster, Roosevelt undertook a period of rest and recuperation over the coming months, in which he cut down his smoking to a dozen cigarettes a day, as well as a single cocktail in the evenings after meals, and during this period spent some weeks fishing with friends, and after returning to the White House, only worked for 4 hours per day. Another source of comfort for Franklin during this time was the rekindling of his relationship with his former flame, Lucy Mercer, who had married after the breakup of her affair with Franklin nearly 20 years before, but was now widowed, and their reunion was instigated by Roosevelt's daughter Anna, who organised for them to see one another again behind her mother's back. This was perhaps because Eleanor and Franklin were not close as husband and wife by this stage, as they acted more like close friends or political allies rather than a couple, Therefore, Anna sought to alleviate her father's stress, as well as his loneliness, by helping him to see Lucy once again. However, later after his death, Eleanor discovered that Franklin had been seeing Lucy with her daughter's help, resulting in them not speaking to one another for some time. It was evident by late 1944 that the Americans were going to be victorious on all fronts in World War II, and despite being advised not to by those close to him due to his ill health, Roosevelt decided to campaign for a fourth term as president in November of 1944, from which he emerged victorious once again by claiming over 53% of the popular vote and winning 36 of the 48 states, making him by far the longest-serving president in American history. In early 1939, top scientists such as Albert Einstein had written to Roosevelt warning him of Germany's possible nuclear weapons program, and shortly afterwards, the United States initiated the Manhattan Project with the help of many German Jewish scientists that had fled the country during the 1930s. This program eventually bore fruit on the 16th of July, 1945, when the first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, was successfully detonated in New Mexico, and 3 weeks later the United States dropped 2 further atom bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August, 1945, prompting Emperor Hirohito to announce his country's surrender on the 15th of August. This weapon more than anything made the United States the world's most powerful country after 1945, and until the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons in 1949, the country was practically invulnerable as a nation, as it now had, along with the atom bomb, the largest navy, air force, and economy the world had ever seen. One of Franklin Roosevelt's lasting legacies was his resurrection of the League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations, the formation of which had first been agreed between the President and Winston Churchill as early as 1941, and was finally brought into being in San Francisco on the 25th of April, 1945, at which the UN Charter was drafted, which bound all the participating nations to certain standards of human rights, as well as the preservation of peace for future generations. Over the coming years, Eleanor Roosevelt would also play a key role in the founding of the United Nations, when she was invited by her husband's successor, President Harry Truman, to become a delegate to the General Assembly after 1945, in which she chaired the committee that came to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and would continue to take an active role in politics and humanitarian issues until her own death in 1962. The United Nations was, in many ways, the zenith of President Roosevelt's political career, in which he had brought America out of the Depression, overseen its victory in World War II, and in the United Nations formed an international body whose aim was to prevent a reoccurrence of the massive bloodshed and suffering that had plagued mankind in the first half of the 20th century. However, Roosevelt would never live to see the world he did so much to form, as on the 12th of April 1945, while sitting having his portrait painted at his retreat the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, the president complained of a terrific headache and soon afterwards lost consciousness and slumped forward in his chair. He was then rushed to his bedroom, at which he was diagnosed as having suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and a few hours later at 3:35 p.m, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, aged just 63. It is no exaggeration to say that many Americans were left in despair at the president's passing, as to millions of people he was a savior that had not only delivered the country from the greatest recession of the 20th century, but had also crushed Imperial Japan, as well as Nazi Germany in the largest and most destructive war the world had yet seen. A day after his passing, the president's coffin, draped in the Star-Spangled Banner, was taken to Washington, D.C. and progressed through the streets of the capital, lined with thousands of mourners, before being taken by train to his birthplace at Hyde Park, where he was laid to rest in the rose garden of his Springwood estate, where he, along with his wife Eleanor, remains to this very day. The man known to history as Joseph Vissarionovich Ugashvili, or Joseph Stalin, was born on the 18th of December, 1878, in the eastern Georgian town of Gori. His father, Bizian Ugashvili, was a cobbler and for a while had a thriving business, but he failed to change with the times and his shoes eventually became unfashionable, which resulted in poverty in his family. Yosef's mother, Ekaterina Galadze, was a devout Orthodox Christian who had married Bizian at the age of 16 and went on to give birth to 3 sons, the 2 oldest of which both died in infancy, resulting in Ekaterina placing much of her hopes for the future in her only surviving son. It is clear that Yosef's parents had a tempestuous relationship to say the least, and often argued and fought one another over their son's future, with Ekaterina wanting him to join the priesthood, whilst Bizian was adamant that he should become a cobbler. When Yosef was 10, Ekaterina left Bizian, as he was by this time an abusive alcoholic, who would on his infrequent visits home beat his wife and son, and on one occasion gave Yosef such a severe thrashing that he had blood in his urine for a week. To escape her husband, Ekaterina sought the help of a family friend named Yakov Engashvili, who had been the best man at her wedding to Bizian, and had also been the godfather of her 2 deceased sons. This acquaintance enabled both mother and son to live in relative security for a time, and to get by, Ekaterina undertook housework for her friends in the local area, including a priest named Christopor Charkviani, who later helped gain Yosef a place in the Gori Church School in 1888, where he proved himself to be a capable student and quickly rose to the top of his class. Despite this upturn in fortune, Yosef was nearly denied the chance of further progression in life, as around this time he narrowly survived a smallpox epidemic, which left his face pockmarked, and he also had another close encounter with death soon afterwards, when his left arm was mangled in the wheel of a horse-drawn cart that left it withered for the rest of his days. After recovering, Yosef continued to shine academically, but also gained a reputation for fighting and being naughty with his classmates, but despite his unruly nature, was soon recommended by his teacher to join the spiritual seminary school at Tbilisi and was finally admitted in 1894. After this, Yosef continued to perform well and even had some of his poetry published in local newspapers, but his performance soon went into a steep decline after he began to openly state he was an atheist in class and was often disrespectful to the local monks. This contempt for the old order was soon increased when Yosef began to read forbidden publications such as Nikolai Chernyshevsky's famous novel What Is to Be Done and the notorious Capital by Karl Marx, of whom he subsequently became a great admirer. Yosef then joined secret socialist workers' meetings within Georgia, as resentment and anger was growing in the region at the oppression of the Russian Tsarist government, and soon after this he began to become active in the local resistance and left the spiritual seminary school as a result. By the end of the 19th century, the Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia with an iron fist for 300 years, and although various attempts had been made to modernize the country, it still lagged behind its Western rivals, as its economy was largely based on agriculture rather than industry. At this time, a third of Russia's 126 million people were living in serfdom, even though it had been abolished in 1861, and the vast majority of the populace also lived in abject poverty and had little or no chance of an education or advancement, spending their lives tilling the soil or serving in the army. The government of the country was also highly centralized during this period, with ultimate power lying in the hands of the Tsars, who had near total control over virtually every aspect of Russian life, and had, along with the deeply conservative Orthodox Church, ruled the Russian people's hearts and minds from time immemorial. But this grip on power was beginning to erode by the time of Stalin's birth, as resentment within the country was reaching boiling point and was fueled by technologies such as printing presses becoming more and more widespread, which meant that when the restrictions on the press were lifted in 1912, the reality of modern affairs became accessible to the literate citizens of Russia, and political expression became more prevalent. In many ways, the centralization of power was Russia's greatest strength, as well as its greatest weakness, as the fortunes of the Romanov dynasty as well as those of the nation as a whole largely depended on the qualities or deficiencies of the sovereign, which had until 1894 been Tsar Alexander III. Alexander had ascended to the Russian throne in 1881, after his own father Alexander II, who was arguably the most liberal of the Tsars, had been assassinated by socialist radicals in a bomb attack, just before he was due to announce the creation of a parliament within the Russian state, which was designed to give the people a greater say in governance. Enraged by the death of his father, Alexander III scrapped his father's reforms and initiated an authoritarian clampdown on the country, ending any hope of a more libertarian Russia. This decision, more than any other, would later unleash widespread resentment and hatred across the country, but as Alexander III was a strong, capable Tsar, the likelihood of revolution was remote, as any discontent was stamped on mercilessly as soon as it arose. Then, in 1894, Alexander III died suddenly of kidney disease at the relatively young age of 49, and was replaced by his timid and inexperienced son Nicholas II, who possessed average intelligence and was nowhere near as capable or ruthless as his late father. Nicholas then continued with Alexander's authoritarian policies, but as he did not have the wherewithal or willpower to carry them out effectively, it was not long before unrest and revolution began to rear their ugly heads, and over the next 2 decades, the Tsar's incompetence and weakness slowly allowed those within the country who were now toughened by oppression and filled with hatred at their lot in life, to rise up and overthrow the Romanov dynasty. Georgia had itself been a part of the Russian Empire since 1801, but had since the assassination of Alexander II been relegated to the status of a mere colony, and restrictions were implemented on its population, such as the learning of the Georgian language. This inevitably only fueled the flames of resentment within Georgia over the following decades, and also provided the perfect conditions for the proliferation of radical anti-establishment ideas. In 1899, Yosef began work as a meteorologist in Tbilisi, which was an easy, stress-free job, meaning that he was able to read more revolutionary literature whilst at work, and he soon developed an even more fierce hatred and opposition of the Tsarist regime, as well as the Orthodox Church. During this period, Yosef also began to give talks to local workers and attend clandestine meetings, in which he organised strikes in local factories, which inevitably attracted the attention of the Tsarist secret police, or Okhrana, and to avoid arrest, he then went into hiding and lived off the charity of his friends and socialist supporters. Yosef then joined the fledgling Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP, in 1899, which was a left-wing socialist movement that had been founded in 1898, that would eventually become the Communist Party in 1912. The tactics the party used were often infiltration and agitation, where members would obtain jobs in local factories, in which they would then stir up opposition against the workers' employers, as well as the local authorities, that would then result in strikes and demonstrations, which would often result in fighting with the local police. Yosef was particularly gifted at this kind of agitation or rabble-rousing, and he soon proved himself to be one of the more radical or hard-line members of the party, as he had a reputation for promoting the use of violence, which was a tactic he would come to excel at over the coming years. He then rose rapidly within the Tbilisi branch of the RSDLP and helped to organise further strikes in the local area, which resulted in him being nominated to join the committee of the local party in 1901, but fearing arrest he then moved to Batumi, on the coast of the Black Sea, where he again organised protests, at one of which many people were shot by the local police. A year later, Yosef was involved in the instigation of an attack on a local prison where several party leaders were being detained, during which over a dozen of the attackers were killed, and after he organised yet another protest on the day of his comrades' funerals, he was arrested and sentenced in 1903 to 3 years' exile in Siberia. This was at the time not a death sentence in all but name, as it would later become, as people were sent to Siberia as a punishment for a definite period, after which they could return, but Yosef would later use this punishment as one of his instruments of terror and order the exile of millions of dissidents, political enemies, and class traitors to labour camps in the frozen wastes of the Russian hinterland. Despite being exiled, Yosef had no intention of respecting its duration and eventually managed to return to Tbilisi, where he helped edit an underground newspaper called the Proletarian Struggle, in which he advocated for the Georgian branch of the RSDLP to split off from the Russian branches, as he began to become disillusioned with the movement's methods and objectives. It was also around this time that divisions began to occur within the RSDLP, which would eventually split into various sub-factions or groups, including the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin and the Mensheviks under Julius Martov. The Bolsheviks were seen as the hardline wing of the party, who advocated strict membership rules as well as the nationalization or collectivization of farmland, whilst the Mensheviks argued that worker productivity would be increased if a degree of private ownership was maintained. Yosef, who was himself a hardliner as well as being pro-violence, naturally sided with the Bolsheviks, as he hated many local Menshevik party members within Georgia, who were also in the minority. Then on the 22nd of January 1905, at a mass protest in St. Petersburg, Tsarist troops opened fire on thousands of unarmed civilians, in which hundreds were killed and many times more were injured. This caused large-scale unrest and civil disorder throughout the country, which would become known as the 1905 Revolution, and in Georgia itself, rioting and ethnic violence broke out between various groups, which prompted Yosef to form the Bolshevik Battle Squad, with which he undertook robberies, raided arms caches, stole printing equipment, and attacked government troops. Having now established himself as a leader within the Bolsheviks in Georgia, Yosef was then sent in November of 1905 to St. Petersburg, where a party conference was taking place, and it was at this meeting that Yosef would meet Vladimir Lenin for the first time. He then a year later travelled to the Swedish capital of Stockholm to attend the 4th Congress of the RSDLP, at which a vote was taken to restrict the raising of party funds to peaceful means only, which both Lenin and Yosef disagreed with, and they then determined to continue with their armed robberies regardless. As a result of this, Yosef increased his campaign of violent robberies, culminating in him planning along with Lenin a notorious robbery on an armed convoy in Tbilisi, which was carrying a large amount of money to the Imperial Bank, and after the gunfire had died down, around 40 Bolsheviks lay dead, but Yosef escaped unharmed with the loot. As well as armed robberies, Yosef also undertook other forms of illegal money raising, such as kidnapping the children of wealthy locals and holding them to ransom, but this spree of violence and intimidation soon enabled the Tsarist secret police to catch up with him, and he was eventually arrested and exiled once again. In 1912, Yosef was asked by Lenin to join the Bolshevik Central Committee, which he agreed to, but he was then later that year arrested once again and sent into exile, but soon escaped and went underground in St. Petersburg, where he secretly edited the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, meaning truth, and it was whilst working on this newspaper that Yosef started to use the pseudonym Stalin, meaning steel, which he would be known as for the rest of his life. Indeed, it was the editorship of Pravda that brought Stalin to the attention of many Bolsheviks within the Communist Party, and also cemented his position as one of Lenin's right-hand men, until by the outbreak of the First World War, he was one of the most influential men in the movement. Over the coming years, Stalin was arrested and exiled on several occasions, and after the First World War broke out, and the situation on the front became more and more desperate, both he and his fellow exiles were conscripted into the Russian army, although he was then, after a medical, ruled out of military service due to his disabled left arm. Stalin then requested to be allowed to serve the rest of his exile in Siberia, which was accepted, but whilst he was there, the February Revolution of 1917 broke out in St. Petersburg, which culminated in Nicholas II being forced to abdicate the Russian throne, and he was then replaced by a provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky. But the new regime's grip over the country was still relatively weak, meaning that the influence of the far left in the shape of the Bolsheviks continued to grow unchecked over the coming months, and eventually, after a series of crackdowns, Lenin secured a majority within the party to try a coup, and in the early hours of the 7th of November, 1917, the Bolsheviks took control of power stations in St. Petersburg, along with other important public services, such as the telephone exchange. Then the Soviet-controlled warship, the Aurora, which was anchored off the shore of the city, opened fire on the now surrounded Winter Palace, which soon afterwards forced the provisional government to surrender, meaning that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in power in Russia, and they then began the process of consolidation. In this clampdown, Lenin used the newly formed Bolshevik secret police, or the Cheka, to crush anyone who was deemed to pose a threat to the new regime, and estimates indicate that over 100,000 people were killed over the following months, many consisting of Tsarist supporters, the middle class, and the intellectual elite. The capital of the newly instated Russian Soviet Federate Socialist Republic was then moved to Moscow, mainly because of its centralized location, and also because Lenin wanted to distance the new regime from St. Petersburg, which had been the Tsarist capital since the reign of Peter the Great. Despite this success, Russia was still at war with Germany and Austria, and as the dilapidated Russian economy had been unable to sustain the army during the conflict, the resulting food shortages, discontent, and widespread chaos meant that Lenin was eager to sue for peace. Another reason for peace being necessary was that the Bolsheviks needed to consolidate their power over Russia, and any continuation of the war could potentially weaken their tenuous grip over the country. But their position was soon strengthened when a ceasefire was agreed with Germany on the 15th of December 1917, and hostilities with the Central Powers then formally ceased, with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of March 1918. Despite the conclusion of Russia's involvement in the First World War, there was still fierce resistance against Lenin's regime within the country itself, as the Bolshevik seizure of power in the October Revolution had effectively unified people from all corners of the political spectrum against the communists, who became known as the White Russians, and it was not long before fighting broke out between the two factions, igniting the conflict known to history as the Russian Civil War. This war effectively split Russia into dozens of regions, and in some cases states, that fought one another for supremacy over or independence from Moscow. However, the Bolsheviks, with the help of Leon Trotsky, who had established a million-strong fighting force by this time, in the shape of the Red Army, was eventually able, after fierce fighting, to subdue the government's enemies, as well as the intervention of foreign powers on the side of the White Russians, until by the 1920s, they held the upper hand and controlled the country once again. As food and supplies were often scarce in Russia during the conflict, Stalin, who had returned from exile in the aftermath of the February Revolution in 1918, and had been an important supporter in Lenin's later coup, was sent to Tsaritsyn, which he would later name Stalingrad, in order to procure food supplies and oversee the Red Army's campaign against the Whites in the region. During his mission of food procurement, Stalin ordered the execution of anyone who defied his orders, and his tenure as the commander of the Red Army in the region was largely met with criticism from his Bolshevik party comrades, who disapproved of his strategy of sending mass numbers of Red Army troops against the Whites, which often resulted in massive losses. It is clear that in their campaign against the White Russians, the Bolsheviks had started to use methods which far outweighed the former Tsarist regime, in terms of brutality and ruthlessness, although to be fair, both sides in the Russian Civil War committed atrocities. However, it is clear that one of the most effective and relentless advocates of the communist policy of terror was Stalin, who was more and more seen as a hardliner within the regime, as he more than anything wanted to eradicate resistance in all its forms. Perhaps the most famous example of the increasingly ruthless approach the communists employed then came on the 17th of July 1918, when Nicholas II and his wife and children were executed by the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg, where they were being held, in which the Tsar and his family were peppered with bullets and then bayoneted and clubbed to death by their communist captors. During this period, Stalin was assigned to various military commands during the latter stages of the Russian Civil War, in which he proved to be ruthless in dealing with the deserters, and was ultimately rewarded by the government with the Order of the Red Banner for his services to the communist cause. Shortly after this, Stalin was also involved in the Polish-Soviet War, which had started when the newly re-established Republic of Poland had sought to capitalize on the state of upheaval within Russia in order to expand its eastern frontier. During the conflict, Stalin often disobeyed orders, and again received criticism from within the Bolshevik party for his increasingly harsh methods. However, the war eventually ended in Poland's favour and a peace treaty was signed shortly afterwards, as Russia was still too weak to fight on multiple fronts. This treaty, combined with the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War, finally allowed them to concentrate their efforts on internal affairs, which in the early years of the regime's rule was centred around centralising control of the country in virtually every respect. However, in the early 1920s, opposition to the Soviet regime resurfaced in the shape of strikes and unrest, particularly from the country's rural population, who had by and large not been involved in the communist seizure of power and were on the whole supporters of the deposed Tsar or the White Russians. The Civil War had also caused massive upheaval across the country itself, as although the Soviets controlled the urban centres, nearly 80% of the Russian population were rural peasants, whose lives and farms had been most affected by the fighting, and soon led to widespread food shortages across the country, that caused a mass exodus from Russia's northern cities as its urban population migrated south to find food. This migration was a problem for the Bolsheviks, because the vast majority of their supporters were industrial workers and city dwellers, who were now becoming more and more dissatisfied with the regime's inability to secure adequate food supplies. To resolve this issue, the Soviets then ramped up their policy on food requisitioning that was put in place to concentrate Russian agriculture output and feed the Red Army, as well as the dwindling population of the country's urban centres, such as Moscow. But this policy soon resulted in mass starvation and famine across rural southern Russia, as hundreds of thousands of farmers' crops were simply taken from them, which left both they and their families with no source of income or food, and culminated in the Russian famine of 1921 to 1922, in which several million peasants died from starvation. This dire situation then prompted Lenin in 1921 to make concessions in his new economic policy, which allowed state industry and private enterprise to coexist, and replace food requisitioning with taxation that allowed the country's farmers to keep and sell the crops they produced. This policy was largely successful in restoring adequate food production. However, it was unpopular with certain members of the communist regime, such as Trotsky, who argued that the state should repossess all worker output, whilst economic moderates such as Lenin and Stalin were in favour of a degree of private enterprise, so long as it was controlled and directed by the state. Stalin's support of Lenin had made him an important figure within the regime by this time, and was then in 1922 nominated to become the party's new general secretary, which was an administrative position that placed him in charge of party membership along with disciplinarian duties. This role also gave Stalin a foothold in virtually every aspect of the governance of Russia, as after all the party was the state, and as power was highly centralized, the responsibility of Stalin's new role was spread across the entirety of the Soviet government and therefore the country. This meant he was able to gather information on potential enemies, and he then gradually and quietly began to accumulate power through ever-expanding bureaucracy, which lay at the root of his eventual rise. Then in May 1922, Lenin suffered a severe stroke which left him partially paralysed and bedridden, although he was still able to make decisions and dictate policy, and Stalin, who was now his right-hand man, acted as a messenger between him and the Council of People's Commissars, which kept him fully informed of all political events and decisions, but also enabled him to control Lenin's communications. Soon after this, Lenin began to complain to his wife about Stalin, saying he was unintelligent and later, perhaps fearing death was imminent, dictated a document that is now known as Lenin's Testament, in which he urged for a reform within the party's ruling elite, and criticised its leaders, and also recommended that Stalin should be removed from his position as General Secretary. This document, which Lenin wanted read out on the 12th Party Congress, could have, if it had ever seen the light of day, ended Stalin's career, but both he and his fellow party leaders, who were also criticised in Lenin's testament, had the document suppressed and did not allow it to be released to subordinate party members. It was around this time in late December of 1922 that the separate Soviet republics of Russia, Ukraine, Belorussia, and the Transcaucasian Soviet, which was comprised of states such as Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, agreed to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that would last until 1991, and would, with Stalin's help, become the second most powerful nation on Earth, in a matter of decades. Lenin, however, would never see his brainchild reach the zenith of its power, as he died on the 21st of January 1924, and the major figures within the Soviet regime then began to vie with one another for control of the Communist Party, and Stalin as General Secretary then began to position himself as one leading candidate to succeed his former master. Perhaps his biggest rival in this power struggle came in the shape of Leon Trotsky, who had joined the Bolsheviks from the Mensheviks just before the October Revolution of 1917, and had founded the Red Army and led it to victory in the Russian Civil War, which made him a hero in many people's eyes within the Communist Party, and secured his position as one of Lenin's most trusted lieutenants. Initially, Trotsky seemed, at least by outward appearances, to be the favourite to succeed Lenin. However, Stalin had over the previous years been using his position as General Secretary, which controlled party appointments, to surround himself with loyal followers, who owed their promotions to him, and meant he was gradually able to wrestle control of the party away from Trotsky and his allies, and fill its leading positions with persons answerable to him. Trotsky himself then began to criticize Stalin, whom he saw as a rightist, arguing that Lenin's capitalist new economic policy should be reversed, and then began to ally himself with other leading Bolshevik members, known as the Left Opposition, and later the United Opposition, who were opposed to the General Secretary's ever-increasing grip of the Soviet Union. Stalin's position as General Secretary also gave him another advantage over his opponents, as he now had control over the now widespread bureaucracy across Russia, which fed him information on political developments as well as people. And it is certainly fair to say that even though Stalin in his early life had proven himself to be brutal and ruthless, he was also incredibly intelligent and cunning. Stalin, then capitalizing on Trotsky's growing weakness and isolation within the party, aligned himself with influential people within the regime, many of whom owed their careers to him, until within a matter of months his rival was alienated and excluded from the country's governance. This policy of surrounding himself with very effective yes-men proved to be extremely effective in securing power for Stalin, as well as maintaining it, but eventually proved to be counterproductive, as later in World War II, government officials and Red Army generals were terrified of making independent decisions in fear of provoking the boss's wrath. For the time being at least, Stalin was secure at the centre of his bureaucratical spider's web, which enabled him to replace his enemies from important government positions, until Trotsky himself was removed as the People's Commissioner of Military and Naval Affairs in January of 1925, and was then also expelled from the Central Committee in October of 1927, and later from the Soviet Union altogether in 1929. During his exile, Trotsky became the figurehead of the opposition to his old rival, and went on to write numerous books and articles condemning his former comrade, until finally Stalin ordered his secret services to assassinate his arch-enemy, which succeeded after Trotsky was attacked with an ice axe by a Soviet agent at his house in Mexico City, and after being taken to hospital died from his injuries on the 21st of August 1940. Trotsky's exile meant that Joseph Stalin was now the leader of a coalition within the Central Committee of the Soviet regime, and as most of his fellow committee members were under his thumb, he was now the boss in all but name, as the role of the head of government lay in the hands of his right-hand man, Vyacheslav Molotov, who was one of his most trusted supporters. Molotov would later play a crucial role in the re-establishment of the collectivization of agriculture, and would also in his later role of Minister of Foreign Affairs become one of the most famous and recognized members of Stalin's inner circle, as he met with world leaders including Hitler in the lead up to World War II. For some time during the 1920s, there were growing concerns that Lenin's new economic policy was too capitalist, as there were fears that the peasant farmers, who had benefited from Lenin's reforms, were profiteering by controlling the sale of their crops, and this sense of distrust was then further compounded by grain supplies plummeting by 70% between 1926 and 1927, which prompted Stalin to revise Lenin's economic policy, as he could not afford Russia's urban centres to experience food shortages yet again. Another reason for the need for economic change was the relative backwardness of the Soviet industry, that lagged decades behind its Western rivals, and it was this, combined with the dwindling food production, that finally prompted Stalin to enact the first of his 5-year plans from 1928 to 1932, in which collectivization was reintroduced and the growth of heavy industry was given priority. This resulted over the coming years in hundreds of factories, mines, and plants being opened across the Soviet Union that doubled the country's industrial workforce from 3 to 6 million in 5 years, and also increased industrial output by over 100%. This rapid and forced industrialization, which arguably came at the cost of tens of thousands of peasants' lives, eventually would give the Soviet Union the industrial capability it needed to maintain the war against Nazi Germany, as without it, the country would almost certainly have not been able to manufacture the thousands of tanks, aircraft, and other war materials that were required in order to claim victory. Another part of Stalin's first 5-year plan was the ramping up of his policy of collectivization, which inevitably meant that the Soviet Union's farmers, who had hitherto enjoyed a degree of freedom or private ownership, would have to be brought into line, under state control. These affluent farmers, who were known as kulaks, were a class of landowner who had, through reforms in the 19th century and Lenin's new economic policy, accumulated some degree of wealth, as they had been allowed to sell their crops instead of handing them over to the government, on the condition they paid taxes instead. This was effectively capitalism in many people's eyes within the Soviet regime, and it was this assertion, combined with a drop in food production and rumours of profiteering, that prompted Stalin and the Central Committee to order the seizure of the kulaks' grain supply, along with their farms by force, after which it was declared that they were to be liquidated as a class, resulting in hundreds of thousands of arrests across the country. Estimates vary, but the number of kulaks who were either arrested, sent to Siberia, or killed is thought to number in the hundreds of thousands and very likely the millions. But this policy of arrest, exile, and eradication meant that the class of people who were primarily responsible for producing most of Russia's grain was wiped out in the space of a few years, and would eventually lead to mass starvation and famine. The kulaks were then replaced with collectives and communes, which involved peasants working on the now state-owned farms, although as those involved in this state-run system of agriculture did not own the land they worked on or indeed the food they produced, productivity slumped, as there were no positive incentives for the communal farmers to work hard. Riots and uprisings then broke out across the Soviet Union in the late 1920s as a result of these policies, that were then stamped out by the Red Army and the NKVD, which controlled internal affairs across the Soviet Union, and would eventually be combined with the secret police in 1934 and become Stalin's most dreaded tool of terror and suppression. Stalin then, in 1929, enacted a further cultural clampdown on the population of the Soviet Union, in which schools were brought fully under state control, as were newspapers and libraries, and religion was also effectively outlawed, and churches were either burnt to the ground or demolished. In short, Stalin was seeking to bring about total state control over every aspect of life, from cradle to grave, and some have since suggested that he was merely concerned with gaining absolute power over the Soviet population, but it could also be argued that he saw state control as a necessity in order to suppress ideas such as individualism, which had to be prevented in order to lay the ground for a true communist society, which religion, money, and social classes were not a part of. In essence, Stalin faced a choice between allowing a degree of private enterprise to continue, as well as freedom of thought and speech, which would have potentially resulted in the death of socialism and by extension communism itself, or enacted the principles of socialism, which inevitably meant that he would have to end all individual freedoms, as many people throughout the country simply did not want to live under a socialist state. Capitalist historians argue that this is perhaps the greatest weakness that lays in the heart of socialism, which seeks to end class structure within nations, as well as private ownership, in order to pave the way for a true communist utopia that is free of money and the state, as implementing socialism is entirely dependent on the population of a given nation, wanting to give up their private property, which has always resulted in every country collectivization has been attempted in the state having to use force, which is arguably best exemplified by Stalin's Russia. In essence, Stalin's solution to the resistance of those who did not agree with his policies of collectivization was the use of force and suppression, which inevitably meant that the state control over speech and thought was also necessary in order to crush dissent. Modern-day socialists in the Western world have argued that the path to true socialism must lie in gaining the approval of a given population for collectivization via democratic means. However, as no socialist country has successfully enacted a class-free, communal society, the validity of true socialism as a form of governance, not to mention its economic merits, remains hotly debated and deeply contentious to say the least. In the case of Stalin's Soviet Union at least, the state was everything: state farms, state schools, state libraries, state industry, and everything a person thought or did was influenced and dictated by the state, and any dissension, no matter how minor, was stamped on with merciless efficiency. Stalin and his allies were in effect bringing about the most ruthless and all-powerful dictatorship in human history, as control was total by the early 1930s and outside influence was zero. But these policies of the centralization of power soon backfired in early 1932, when a particularly harsh winter in the Ukraine and southern Russia, along with collectivized farming, resulted in an unprecedented famine that would ultimately result in the deaths of nearly 3 million people. This was despite the fact the grain harvest in the Soviet Union was roughly the same as in 1930, but the government's increasingly harsh requisitions of grain resulted in the majority of the country's food being sent to its population centers, culminating in massive food shortages in rural areas. Another cause of these shortages was that Stalin had enacted a policy of selling the Soviet Union's grain supplies abroad, for which he in return received aid and materials for the country's industrial base, that he was attempting to modernize and enlarge at breakneck speed. Many have argued that this famine was entirely avoidable and that Stalin's policies of redistribution had been its direct cause, although he himself blamed subversive elements within the Ukraine and southern Russia and attempted to deflect the blame from himself. What then followed is known as the Great Terror and the Great Purge, which was instigated after the murder of Stalin's close friend Sergei Kirov, the head of the Communist Party in Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg, in December of 1934. Some have claimed that it was in fact Stalin who ordered the murder of Kirov, as he suspected him of disloyalty and was resentful of his growing popularity within the Communist Party. Whatever the reason and whoever gave the order, Stalin used his friend's death as a pretext to order the arrest and execution of anyone he thought was complicit in the incident, as well as anyone who had opposed him in the preceding years. During the Great Purge, which lasted from 1936 to 1938, Stalin ordered the NKVD to undertake massive clampdowns on the Soviet population, the Red Army, and the Communist Party itself, in which potential dissidents were arrested, including many high-ranking government officials, who were often exiled or executed after public show trials. Estimates vary, but the total number of deaths that resulted from this purge is thought to have been as high as 1.25 million people, including former aristocrats, business owners, and clergymen, many of whom posed no kind of threat to Stalin, who even had the wives of many of his closest followers arrested and sometimes killed in order to terrify them into submission. Another weapon in Stalin's arsenal of terror were the gulags, which was a government-run system of forced labor camps that had been set up in the early 30s in mostly remote areas, where people were sent as punishment and were in many cases worked to death. As many as 18 million people passed through the Gulag system between 1930 and 1950, but the exact number of deaths is still unknown. However, some historians state that the total number to be around 1.5 million people. As previously mentioned, a major part of Stalin's Great Purge was his liquidation of the officer corps of the Red Army, which was instigated to rid any opposition within the armed forces and further consolidate Stalin's control, in which hundreds of Red Army officers and generals were arrested and executed, as well as former White Army soldiers from amongst the civilian population. The historical consensus is that this purge severely weakened the fighting capability of the Red Army, as many of its best and brightest were arrested, exiled, or killed, meaning that when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the army's leadership had in effect been crippled, and this arguably contributed to many of the massive defeats and losses the Russians experienced in the early stages of the war. By this time, Germany was a rising power in Europe, and Stalin was well aware of Adolf Hitler's hatred of Bolshevism, and as a result started to prepare for a possible war with Germany. But due to the purges of the Red Army, its ability to fight was minimal to say the least, and its equipment, although plentiful, was in many cases outdated or in a state of disrepair. To buy time, the Soviet Premier then pursued a tactic of appeasement with Germany during the late 1930s that culminated in Russia signing a non-aggression pact with Germany on the 23rd of August 1939, and after Germany defeated the Poles in their invasion 1 month later, the Soviets occupied the eastern half of Poland, which had been arranged as part of the agreement between the two nations. During this occupation, the Red Army and the NKVD captured thousands of Polish officers, who were later executed on Stalin's orders, along with members of the country's intelligentsia, in the Katyn massacre of April and May 1940, in which upwards of 22,000 Poles were murdered. This occupation of the western half of Poland then prompted both Britain and France to declare war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, and anticipating, as many did, that the war between the Allies and the Germans would be a long drawn-out affair, much the same as World War I, Stalin offered Germany support in the shape of food and oil supplies. Whilst Germany was preoccupied with the Western powers, Stalin turned his attention to his northern neighbour Finland, which he saw as an easy target, as he wanted to use the country as a buffer zone against the possible future war with Hitler, and also wanted to secure naval ports for the Soviet Navy in the Baltic Sea. Stalin then attempted to intimidate the Finns into submission by offering their government an ultimatum in October of 1939 to hand over the border region of Finland to Soviet control, along with numerous Baltic islands, and also allow Soviet troops to be stationed in Finnish territory. But the Finns refused the Soviet demands, and after negotiations broke down, Stalin ordered a full-scale invasion of the country, which began on the 30th of November 1939. Despite the fact that the Red Army was the largest on Earth at this time, the Finns, who had constructed an elaborate defense network along their southern border, wore down the advance of Stalin's troops, in which he lost some 250,000 men, whilst the Finns only lost 25,000. This was seen as a humiliation for Stalin himself, as his Red Army had been unable to steamroller the numerically inferior Finnish army, and after a peace treaty was signed in March 1940 that secured the buffer zone that the Soviets had wanted, a rapid overhaul of the Red Army was instigated over the coming months, in which tactics, training, and equipment were reformed and overhauled. Stalin, who was himself responsible for the massive losses the Red Army had endured, privately acknowledged that he had made mistakes in the lead up to the war, and afterwards sought to reform the leadership of the Red Army by sacking his defense commissar, Klement Voroshilov, and replace him with Semyon Timoshenko. It could be argued, however, that Stalin's disastrous invasion of Finland in the end worked to his benefit, as many of the deficiencies within the Red Army were identified during the conflict, which enabled the Soviets to prepare for the later German invasion. The flip side to this is that the ineffectiveness of the Red Army in the Winter War, as it is now known, only further encouraged Adolf Hitler to hasten his invasion plans of the Soviet Union, and at one point he even stated in reference to Stalin's regime, "You only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Next, Stalin turned his attention to the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as northern Romania, which he again wanted to use as buffer zones between him and Germany, and after they were incorporated into the Union of Soviet Republics in August 1940, mass arrests and deportations were instigated to subdue the local population. During his early years as Soviet Premier, Stalin regarded France, and in particular Britain, as greater threats than Germany, as they had supported the White Army during the Civil War. However, as fascism, and in particular German National Socialism, began to manifest itself during the 1920s and early 1930s, the Man of Steel was forced to take the threat of Hitler's Third Reich seriously, and thusly began to build up his nation's armed forces. It could also be argued that the signing of the non-aggression pact with Germany gave Stalin a false sense of security, as he understandably calculated that a war between Germany and the Western powers would last for years and would give him plenty of time to build up his defences, the strength of which he hoped would make Hitler think twice before starting any war. Then, both to Stalin and to the world's surprise, Germany defeated the French and Allied forces in just 6 weeks between May to June 1940, culminating in the French surrender, which left Britain alone in the war, and Hitler, after failing to invade the Iron Nation during the Battle of Britain, perhaps inevitably made the Soviet Union his next target. This invasion, which was scheduled to begin in the early summer of 1941, was codenamed Redbeard, or Barbarossa, after the Teutonic king that had fought the Slavs in the Middle Ages, and was comprised of 3 massive army thrusts, involving 3 million German troops who would use blitzkrieg, or lightning war, to surround and annihilate Stalin's forces, before driving onwards towards Leningrad in the north, Kiev in the Ukraine, as well as Moscow itself. Stalin, in contrast to popular myth, received no concrete intelligence on Hitler's true intentions before the invasion began, as the reports he did receive were vague or unclear. Therefore, he continued to stall for time, as he believed the German reassurances that the build-up of its troops on the Soviet border were not part of an invasion, and hoped at worst that they were to be used to threaten him and were part of an impending ultimatum. The reality was, however, that Hitler was planning to invade the Soviet Union, and he then gave the go-ahead for the invasion by broadcasting the word Düsseldorf on the afternoon on the 21st of June 1941, and at around 3:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June, Operation Barbarossa began with bombing raids on cities across the Western Soviet Union as far afield as Leningrad, and after a massive artillery barrage had ceased, Hitler's forces crossed the Soviet border. Over the coming weeks, the Germans cut through the Russians like a knife through butter, and it seemed to all, including Stalin, that disaster and defeat were certain. However, despite the colossal losses the Red Army sustained during the opening stages of Barbarossa, which numbered in the millions, it ultimately managed to mount one of the greatest military comebacks in human history, and defeated Hitler's Germany once and for all. Another myth which is often cited about Stalin is that he failed to prepare the Soviet Union for the war with Hitler. However, when the fact is considered that the Red Army in 1941 had the most men, tanks, and aircraft of any army in the world, the Man of Steel can hardly be said to have neglected the country's defences. If anything, the Soviet Red Army was too large, or unwieldy, as resupplying and equipping it with modern equipment inevitably took time, and as the Russians had never fought a modern, large-scale industrialized war against a major European power before, the true effectiveness of its armed forces, as well as its equipment, was still unknown at this time. It should also be remembered that the German army in 1941 had just defeated the armies of France and Britain in a very short period of time. Therefore, it should be no surprise that the Russians folded under the German onslaught during the early stages of Barbarossa, as they were fighting the most highly organized fighting machine in the world at that time. Since World War II, many theories have been put forward regarding why and how the Soviet Union was triumphant over Nazi Germany. Some claim that Hitler was incompetent and simply declared war on the wrong countries at the wrong time, whilst others state that it was a close-run thing and could have gone either way, and many often claim that Stalin himself was incompetent and only won the war because he allowed his generals to do their jobs. In truth, all the parties involved, including Stalin, Hitler, and all the leading generals and military commanders on both sides, made massive mistakes during the war in Russia. Therefore, it is overly simplistic to attribute blame or praise to any one person or cite any given mistake as being a turning point in the conflict. Although the Soviet Union was far poorer than the Western powers, its greatest advantage in its war with Hitler was arguably the sheer size of its population, which in the early 1940s totaled around 200 million people, whilst Germany on the other hand had a population of 90 million, including Austria, Czechoslovakia, and occupied Poland. More importantly, around 45% of the population in the Soviet Union was under the age of 20 in 1941, compared with only 33% of the German population, meaning that Stalin could call on around 45 million men in total if needed, whilst Hitler had a maximum of around 15 million men of fighting age. This meant that Germany had a far smaller pool of potential troops to call upon during the war on the Eastern Front, as by 1943 both the German and Russian armies that had started the conflict had effectively been wiped out, but the Russians were soon able to replace their lost comrades with men of fighting age, whilst Germany by the end of the war had to call upon reserves of men who were not of fighting age, such as children and even pensioners. These figures do not include the 800,000 women who served in the Soviet armed forces during World War II, many of whom were deployed in combat roles, including fighter pilots, bomber crews, and even snipers, one of the most famous of whom, Tatiana Kostrina, amassed a staggering 120 kills during the early stages of the war, before she herself died in hand-to-hand combat in 1943, and was later posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Another important and better known factor was geography, as the Russians could afford to lose massive expanses of ground to the Germans after the invasion began, which in turn stretched their supply lines to the limit, and combined with freezing Russian winters and the ill preparedness of Germany's industry to supply a large-scale war, soon led to disaster. This of course ignores the massive impact the Western Allies had on Germany during the conflict across multiple theatres, such as the blockade of Germany by Britain's Royal Navy, its Arctic convoys to Russia, the Allied bombings of Germany throughout the war, the German Enigma codes being cracked, and the Axis defeat in North Africa, which in terms of the troops lost was comparable to Stalingrad. It should also be noted that the first stages of the war in Russia from a German perspective were incredibly successful, and the fact that the Wehrmacht maintained its fighting capabilities in the Soviet Union for so long, against such overwhelming odds, is a testament to the talent of its commanders, as well as the fighting ability of its soldiers, as the near total success that Hitler's armies enjoyed during the early stages of the war have as much to do with German military brilliance as they have with Soviet deficiencies. In the initial stages of Hitler's invasion, his soldiers wiped out entire Soviet divisions, who often surrendered by the hundreds of thousands, and after the fall of the city of Minsk a week after the start of the invasion, Stalin was left in such a state of shock that he locked himself away for days, resulting in the paralysis of the country's government. Since World War II, much has been made of the fact that Stalin at the start of the war at least acted incompetently, as he refused to move troops up to his border with Germany before the fighting began. However, it could be argued that this was the correct strategy, as the primary goal of Blitzkrieg was to surround and destroy the enemy forces in the field. Therefore, Stalin choosing to hold back large portions of his troops in the lead up to the invasion could be said to have been the correct decision, as they would have almost certainly been eradicated in the first few days of Operation Barbarossa if they had been stationed closer to the German border. As well as this, recent research undertaken by German military historians states that the Soviet counterattacks caused severe delays and losses to the Wehrmacht in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, and in the end delayed them for long enough to make the seizure of Moscow in 1941 impossible. It should also be remembered that the German army and German industry were geared to fighting short-term, quick, decisive wars. Thusly, the longer Stalin could prolong the conflict, the more likely a positive outcome became, as Hitler's armies were at their strongest at the very start of the invasion, and with every day that passed its numbers dwindled, its resources declined, and its supply lines lengthened. In short, although many of Stalin's counteroffensives early in the war resulted in colossal losses, he had more than enough reserves behind the front to replace them, as in a brutal war of ideologies which the Russian invasion became, the normal rules of warfare were increasingly ignored, and each side fought with a ferocity that was hitherto unknown in the annals of warfare. Essentially, World War II in the East was about numbers, which Stalin came to appreciate more than anyone, certainly more than Hitler, as he understood that the key to victory lay in manpower, efficient and plentiful logistics, and perhaps most of all, in industrial capacity. An excellent example of this Soviet numerical advantage in equipment was in the production figures of their most celebrated tank, the T-34, which the Russians were able to produce 35,000 of between 1941 and 1945, and these numbers were then added to by them producing nearly 30,000 T-34-85 tanks, which were the T-34s upgraded with an 85mm gun that was designed to take on the powerful German Panther and Tiger tanks. These figures compare starkly with the Germans producing around 50,000 tanks from the pre-war period in the mid to late 30s until 1945, which included all variants of German tank design, from the Panzer I, which was a light tank fitted with machine guns, to the massive Tiger IIs, or King Tigers. In short, the Russians produced more models of one world-class tank in 4 years than the entire German tank output from the mid-30s until 1945, excluding self-propelled guns, which, if included in these figures, means that the Soviets produced some 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 4 years, while the Germans only produced around 63,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 10 years. Also, when one takes into consideration the tens of thousands of American Sherman tanks, as well as all the other types of Allied tanks and self-propelled guns, the Germans were vastly outproduced and outnumbered on all fronts in terms of tanks and self-propelled guns by nearly 3 to 1. These figures also exclude aircraft, transport vehicles, food, oil, and manpower, which were limited for the Axis powers, but almost unlimited for the Russians and the Western Allies. Another staggering fact about the Soviet Union during World War II was the demolition, transport, and rebuilding of hundreds of factories in the wake of the German invasion, which involved entire industrial complexes being taken apart and moved by railcar, sometimes for thousands of miles to the east, where they were then rebuilt safely out of the reach of Hitler's Luftwaffe. Soviet archives and records state that in each case, up to 10,000 rail cars were required to move a single factory, which must have presented a colossal logistical nightmare for the people responsible for overseeing this mass transportation, and also caused a huge amount of upheaval to the Soviet rail network, which was already strained to the limit with moving and supplying the Red Army, let alone the transportation of as many as 1,500 factories. All in all, these mind-bending figures paint a picture of a country which was by 1942 completely geared to fight a long-term industrialized war, where in contrast Hitler did not place the German economy on a total war footing until well after the war was lost. Therefore, it could be said that the most crucial factor in the Soviet Union winning the war against Germany was simply the fact that Stalin's regime did not collapse, and it was almost entirely down to his own willpower, determination, and absolute control that continuing the fight against Hitler's invasion was possible, let alone winnable. In comparison, when one looks at the Russian defeat in the First World War, the main reason the country capitulated to the Germans was the fall of the Tsar's regime itself, where in contrast in 1812, the Tsardom and the Russian population had remained steadfast in the face of Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion and won as a consequence. Therefore, the fact that Stalin's Russia did not collapse in 1941 and halted the German advance outside of Moscow made victory all the more likely, which was then made all but certain by the Americans entering the war at the end of that year. After the German reversal in Moscow in the winter of 1941, the story of World War II in Russia was one of continuing heavy losses on both sides, until the strength of the German army was finally broken in the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, after which the Soviets ground down German resistance until in 1945 the country collapsed, and with Berlin surrounded, Hitler committed suicide. Although Stalin is rightly considered as being responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of his own people, it must be remembered and respected that both he and Russia itself defeated Hitler's Germany during World War II, losing nearly 26 million troops and civilians in the process, and it is hard to see how anyone else other than Stalin could have held the Soviet Union together during the conflict, as his near total control of the country was essential in securing victory. This, in a nutshell, is one of the greatest paradoxes of Stalin's Russia, as although he committed some of the greatest crimes ever perpetrated in the history of mankind, without the resolve of the man of steel, as well as the massive sacrifices of the Russian people during World War II, the later Allied invasions of Italy and France would have almost certainly have ended in failure, as Hitler's armies would have been far too strong to overcome. In many ways, World War II transformed the Soviet Union into the world power it would remain until the early 1990s. But despite the massive size of its armed forces, which dwarfed the American military in 1945 and occupied the entirety of Eastern Europe, the United States still emerged from the conflict as the world's only superpower, as it had been the first to produce nuclear weapons. Stalin had known that the Americans were developing an atomic bomb for some time, and discussions had been ongoing in the Soviet Union since the 1930s regarding the possibility of building such a weapon, and after the Americans delivered the coup de grace on the Japanese with the aid of nuclear weapons in 1945, the Soviet program was greatly accelerated, until in August 1949 the Russians tested their first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. This made Soviet Russia the world's second superpower along with the United States, and with the two countries now facing off against each other, there now started an atomic arms race, in which Stalin continued to build up his nuclear and conventional forces over the coming years. This consisted of each side creating larger and more powerful nuclear bombs, which ultimately led to the development and testing of the hydrogen bomb, named Ivy Mike, that was detonated by the Americans on November 1st, 1952. And the Soviets soon followed suit by detonating their first hydrogen bomb on November 22, 1955, which was codenamed RDS-37. But Stalin would never see the creation of this ultimate weapon, however, as his health was now failing him, meaning that he took longer and longer breaks away from government, sometimes for months at a time, and would often not allow doctors to examine him for his increasingly serious ailments, and even had several of his physicians arrested through fear they wanted to kill him. The Man of Steel had, in 1945 alone, suffered a minor stroke as well as a severe heart attack that was no doubt, at least in part, caused by the massive stress he had been under over the preceding 30 years, along with the fact that he was a heavy smoker and a regular drinker. Then on the 1st of March 1953, Stalin was found semi-conscious at his Volenskoye dacha. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and despite the best efforts of the available doctors, died on the 5th of March 1953, his daughter later stating that his end was difficult and terrible. Joseph Stalin went from being a peasant in the 19th century to being one of the most powerful men who has ever lived in the late 1940s. In his early years, he was little more than a crime boss, stealing money and killing his enemies, but by the time he died, he had ordered the deaths of tens of millions of people, either through execution, forced labor, or warfare, during what many regard to be the greatest communist experiment of the 20th century. It is also said of him that he abandoned the ideals of Marxism by centralizing control under him, and in doing so created a highly centralized dictatorship, which only served to increase his own power as he denied the workers any say in the governance of the country, which remained in the hands of the few rather than the many. In opposition to this, many capitalists state that every time socialist states have tried to bring about true communism, the process has failed, as many people naturally did not want to give up their family's property and assets. That often resulted in the state having to use force, and in many millions of cases resulted in violence and death. This is why many people around the world today still hope for the realization of true communism, which is a society based on communal ownership, as many feel the transition from capitalism to socialism and then communism has never been enacted, as many socialist governments perhaps inevitably are taken over by power-hungry people, such as Stalin, who denied the workers the right to govern their own destinies. Whether he is a true socialist or not, many historians consider Joseph Stalin to be the most successful dictator in human history, as Adolf Hitler, for example, only ruled over Germany for 13 years, while Stalin, on the other hand, led Russia for nearly 3 decades, and transformed the country from the weak man of Europe into the continent's only superpower, which on the global stage was only rivaled by the United States. In the modern world, there are still those who argue that both Stalin and Mao Zedong were justified in ordering the deaths of millions of their own people, as in their eyes there was no other way of transforming Russia and China, whose population largely consisted of peasants, into modern industrialized states. Other historians have countered this by stating that there is no justification for the millions of deaths ordered by Stalin and Chairman Mao, as industrialization could have been achieved with free markets and property rights such as in the West. It is also argued that millions of deaths under communism were inevitable, as there was no other way of capitalism and property rights ever being ended in Soviet Russia or Maoist China, other than the use of force, and as the state controlled every aspect of life, reducing the population to near slave status and crushing all opposition to the ending of private property was necessary in order to compete with the advanced Western nations. When he was young, Joseph Stalin grew up hating the oppression of the Tsarist regime, but in the end he personified the Orwellian observation that those beset in overturning the hierarchical structure of society often seek power for themselves when offered the opportunity, and in the end the Man of Steel created a state that was authoritarian, oppressive, and psychologically invasive, and was far more terrifying than anything those living under the Tsarist Empire could ever have imagined. No one really has an accurate idea of how many deaths Joseph Stalin is responsible for. Conservative estimates range from 20 to 30 million, whilst others estimate the number to be far greater. Whatever the true figure, there is little argument that Joseph Stalin was one of the 3 greatest mass murderers in human history, along with Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong. In the West, we tend to think we had an important role in defeating Nazi Germany, which in many ways is true. However, it is widely accepted that it was the Soviet Union and its people that crushed Nazi Germany and won World War II in Europe, as despite massive losses, the country still had the largest army in the world when the conflict was over, and dominated the geopolitical landscape for the next 50 years. This gives one an idea of how ruthless Stalin's Russia was, and it is no surprise that he is still considered to be a hero in Russia today, as he after all oversaw the defeat of Hitler's Germany and turned the Soviet Union into the superpower it remained until 1991. All in all, Joseph Stalin was an intelligent, hard-working, ruthless pragmatist who destroyed every enemy who dared oppose him during his lifetime, and in doing so, built the most powerful and all-encompassing dictatorship in history, in which he ordered the deaths of millions, and in the end, got away with it. What do you think of Joseph Stalin? Was he the gold standard of dictators, or a hero who brought about the downfall of Hitler's Germany and transformed his country into a superpower? Let us know in the comment section, and until next time, thank you very much for watching.
We would like to draw your attention to our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards and perks such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.